here in the gallery and watching on the webcast today's meeting of London Plenary Session, London Assembly Plenary Session. The London Assembly is the voice of London, composed of 25 members, elected at the same time as the Mayor in order to hold him to account and scrutinise his policies. This is a plenary meeting of the Assembly, which means that all members are invited to attend. Members are reminded that any electronic devices should not be placed in front of the microphones, which must be turned on to speak and turned off once finished. I can ask the Clerk, Rebecca Arnold, to confirm any apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. We have one apology for absence, which has been received from Assembly Member Duval.
Thank you. Can I now provide an update on some of recent Assembly activity? Since we all gathered here for the Mayor's question time on the 13th of October, the GLA Oversight Committee met to discuss the GLA Group, pension investments, and published a letter to the Minister of London, which pointed out his recommendations in relation to fiscal devolution and further extensions to powers of the London Assembly. The Police and Crime Committee responded to the Baroness Louise Casey's interim report on misconduct procedures and cultures in the Metropolitan Police. The annual Affordable Housing Monitor for 21-22 was published by the Housing Committee, and the committee also discussed the housing challenges that the Mayor faces. The Economy Committee discussed food poverty in London and its causes. The Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee looked at the London Fire Brigade's response to a large number of grass and open land wildfires in July. The impact of the noise pollution on road traffic, the tube and aviation on health and well-being of Londoners was examined by the Environment Committee, and yesterday the Police and Crime Committee examined 10 years of the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. I've also written on the Assembly's behalf to former Assembly members Angie Bray, and current Deputy Mayor Dr. Fiona Twycross and Sir Peter Handy, Chair of London Legacy Development Corporation, and former Transport Commissioner, to congratulate them all on their peerages. And can I ask the Assembly to note the recommendations set out in item number 2? And can I ask the Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests or other relevant interests which they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? Okay. Thank you for that. For the purpose of transparency, I would like to declare non-pecuniary interest in relation to item number 4, as I am the Mayor's nominee and trustee for the Trust for London, and we will be putting questions to representatives from the Trust for London at today's meeting.
Chair, perhaps I should also disclose that I'm a living wage commissioner, and therefore if that topic raises today, then okay. I should declare that.
Thank you. Can I ask the Assembly to confirm the minutes of the London Assembly meetings held on the 8th of September 2022 and 13th of September 2022, and the London Assembly Mayor's Question Time meeting held on the 3rd of October to be signed by me as true records? Thank you. Well, this now brings us to today's main principal business, a question and answer session on the cost of living. Joining us in the chamber, we have Dr. Debbie Weeks-Barnard, Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice. Welcome. Tom Rahilly, Assistant Director for Communities and Social Policy, Greater London Authority. Welcome. Torsten Bell, Chief Executive Officer of Resolution Foundation, and Klara Skrivankova, Programme Director for the Trust for London. Welcome to all of you to the meeting. The Minister for London, Paul Scully MP, had agreed to attend the meetings as set out in the agenda, but has unfortunately had to give his apologies. There will be a lead-off question from me as Chair to each of our guests, who will have 1 minute to respond. Assembly members will then put supplementary questions to our invited guests. Please could I ask the Assembly members to specify who they would like an answer from when they put their questions. Guests, we would be grateful if you would be succinct in your answers so that we can get through all the questions we have for you, because we are operating against a clock. The first question is to the Deputy Mayor, and I will then briefly come with the same question to each of our guests. And the question is this: what cost of living pressures are Londoners facing, and how can they be tackled? You have 1 minute, Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I'll start by saying that given that the cost of living crisis has exacerbated quite a sudden shock to Londoners, regardless of income bracket, many of the interventions that the Mayor has set out have been both universal in nature but also targeted. And there's very specific reasons for that. That's largely because we know that particularly for those on the very lowest incomes, they were already experiencing significant financial challenges even before the cost of living began to bite. Back in 2019, around 440,000 individuals in London had experienced some form of destitution. So we know that even prior to the pandemic, indeed, people in London were experiencing some real financial difficulties. However, we also know that generally across the city, a large proportion of individuals are experiencing financial difficulty. So over half of Londoners have told us that they are financially struggling, and that's up since 35% at 35% at the beginning of the year. So the initiatives that the Mayor has developed have been both universal. So we've set up a couple of advice initiatives. We've set up a hub, which is for anyone, any individual who's experiencing difficulties in paying their bills or experiencing debt to be able to access those services. But we've also recognised that people are digitally excluded, so online services may not work for everyone, and some people prefer face-to-face support, and that for those on the very lowest incomes and those who are experiencing severe debt and hardship, they would prefer to speak to a person face-to-face. So we have invested in advice services specifically for those in low incomes across the city. So I guess in summary, trying to rise to the challenge of meeting the needs of those who are experiencing difficulties perhaps for the first time in their lives financially, as well as those who are experiencing difficulties that they were experiencing before.
Thank you. And Tom?
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure others on the panel will speak to the sort of the challenge that Londoners face and the kind of what we've seen in terms of the increasing costs and the kind of challenges to people's incomes. I wonder if it's helpful for the committee just to talk a little bit about how the GLA as an organisation have organised ourselves to kind of respond to that, following the very kind of clear prioritisation that the Mayor has given. And the Mayor and Debbie, a very kind of clear priority in terms of our kind of programmes. Debbie's spoken to the work we're doing. As an organisation, we've sought to make sure that the kind of resources are there to kind of support that work. That's built on an existing programme of work around financial hardship and support for Londoners on low income, but one that we've seen a significant increase in our resources to dedicated over the past year, which we can certainly speak to, and how we've organised our team. So my own unit has organised itself to be able to respond to the cost of living crisis and the kind of ongoing nature of low income and the challenges that creates in London, both enabling us to address to kind of what we, how we can best mitigate the short-term pressures. And Debbie spoke to some of the work that we're doing around advice, around support on debt, around food security or food insecurity, but also how we're thinking about actually the long-term and the kind of structural nature of some of these problems too, and what that means for Londoners now and into the medium term. So within my own unit, Communities and Social Policy, we have a dedicated team looking at the kind of challenges of financial hardship in London, which is the focus of our cost of living work, and that's work that we've reorganised over the past year to make sure that we're ready to respond as best as possible to this challenge, noting that the great deal of pressures that Londoners are under. And during the current budgeting round, which is ongoing at the moment, we're also looking at actually what that means for kind of resources into next year and future years to make sure that as an organisation we are ready to be able to mitigate and address those challenges as best as possible.
Great. Thank you. And Klara?
So even before the crisis hit, Londoners were already suffering from poverty the most in the country, 27% of London's households. And of course, Londoners are feeling the impact of the pandemic, and that's now compounded by the economic crisis caused by global issues and Brexit. Rise in food banks and the fact that we are now opening up warm places in the city are clear indication of how serious the issue is. Now, there is another grim baseline, and that's 50% of Londoners in poverty are actually working. And in some London boroughs, this number is even higher. And we also know that those that are suffering more than others are minoritized communities, disabled Londoners, and single-parent households. So they should be a priority in terms of focusing on the immediate issues. Now, solutions, well, most of them are actually long-term in terms of policy that needs to focus on the underlying issues rather than dealing with the symptoms. But we also have tools that are available now, such as living wage. No Londoner should be paid less than they need to live on. And living wage is the only rate of pay that is actually calculated on the cost of living, and it is more important now than ever.
Thank you. And over to you, Torsten.
Thank you very much, Chair. I thought I might just offer some reflections on how to break down the headline, there's a cost of living crisis, going on into the phases and the drivers that are causing that over time. I would think about it mainly in terms of the story of the last year is about rising prices. So 10% inflation, highest inflation rate we've seen in 4 decades, the fastest increase in inflation we've seen in 4 decades. That is primarily driven in the early phase of this year into the summer by rises in energy prices, largely globally, which affect the UK more than most parts of Europe because we use so much gas in generating our electricity, and then food prices is a slightly more recent driver of that high inflation rate. Those two things are parts of the inflation basket that are larger parts of the consumption of poorer households than middle and richer households, which is why poorer households are facing a higher inflation rate than the rest of the population right now. It's, without going into all of the weeds, there's also some of the things that are offsetting that high inflation rate, particularly the falls in fuel prices, as in driving fuel prices recently are less relevant in London. In general, those are done by higher income households, but they're also used by households not in large cities. So one of the things that makes London stand out is obviously much more use of public transport, far less use of cars, and that means that the falls in fuel prices that have, for some households, made the last few months a little bit easier, haven't existed in the same degree in London. Those high inflation rates are feeding into falling real wages. That obviously comes on the back of a decade of stagnant real wages for the UK as a whole. That's despite quite fast nominal wage growth in London and across the UK right now. So 5.5% on average, lower in the public sector obviously, but 5.5% on average. That would have been a good set of wage growth figures in any normal times, but when inflation's running at twice that, they are very much not, so falling real wages. So that's where we are. Then you've got two other components to think about, which is housing and the labour market. On housing, we've got a two-part story, which is private rents, which despite, this may not be popular, but despite not rising quite as fast as lots of people have said over the past decade, including in London, have risen fast recently, post-pandemic. But it's really important to differentiate between the stock of private renters and the flow. So the stock of private renters aren't showing in the data yet very large rise in rent levels. It's the flow of people taking on new tenancies who are having a very, very bad year because you've got a very concentrated mismatch between supply and demand over the course of the last year. And you've all been talking about some of that, the double-digit growth in rent levels. But as I say, that's affecting the flow of new renters, particularly, or people having to change their tenancies. But that's not tenable. Obviously, in the end, the flow measure will become the stock measure of rents over time. So that's the story of the last year on housing. The story of the next year is mortgages. And we move from younger people to older people, and we move from poorer households towards richer households as we move over the course of that. London is unusual in its mortgage story because it will be worst hit in terms of the size of the average effect from rising mortgage rates because of high house prices. It will be least affected because you have fewer mortgages, because it's impossible to get a mortgage if you're young or poor in London, obviously. So what you've got is you've got a very large effect, but a very concentrated effect for mortgages in London, which is quite different to lots of the rest of the country in general. And then lastly, on the labour market, it's worth pausing. London, the story of London over the last 30 years is an odd one of going from being a basket case labour market-wise to basically being average. Okay, and I know everyone's forgotten now, but London, like all of the labour market papers in the 90s were about what on earth are we going to do about London and its disastrous labour market, high unemployment, much higher than average. Deindustrialisation used to be a London story. No one talks about that anymore. So London now looks pretty average, 4% unemployment rate. It's a bit above the UK average, but basically average. Biggest falls in unemployment the last year are in London, because London was hardest hit for lower earners during the pandemic in some ways. So that's the good news. Obviously, the bad news is the Bank of England is telling you, and is going to tell you again in an hour and 45 minutes, that interest rates have got to go up because we need unemployment to go up to stop inflation rising. And so that's the next problem you need to be worrying about. So prices over the course of the last year, mortgages coming in the very near future for people remortgaging, and then unemployment rising over the course of next year.
Great. Thank you to all the members of the panel for setting up the ground of the picture, which will be explored in more detail by the Assembly members. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take questions from each of the leads of the different political groups here. We have 4 political groups, and I'm going to take questions from each of the leads. Then to the Assembly members, I'll take questions as you indicate to Rebecca, and you catch the eye of Rebecca. So you will need to indicate to be called. But the first 4 questions from the leads, I know who they are, and I'm going to call them on the list. Right. So the first person is from the Labour Group, Marina Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, panel. My first question is to Klara. Klara, how many Londoners, both adults and children, are at risk of food insecurity this winter? And in your answer, could you address again what needs to happen both practically and policy-wise, please?
So in terms of food insecurity, what we know, and that's before we entered the crisis, that 1 in 5 Londoners already had low or very low food security. So that, again, is the grim baseline that tells us that anybody who falls under that means there will be more Londoners struggling. And we have heard from some experts that, there is a real risk of malnutrition, which is a really shocking thing to be talking about in London in 21st century. There is also, if you look at the Opinions and Lifestyle Survey early this year, and as Torsten said, price of food has already, a few months ago, been one of the top issues for Londoners. Again, this is something that is becoming more and more prevalent. And we now know that food banks, a lot of food banks are starting to ration. So where people were able to go to a food bank several times a week, now they're only able to access it once a week. So, and that's again before proper winter has hit. In terms of what can be done, the solutions, there is focus on humanitarian relief, and I think that's something that's going to be very, very important. Trust for London, for example, has funded the London Community Foundation with £800,000 just for things like humanitarian relief, so basic food packages and contribution to people's bills. So I think we need to really wake up to the fact that we will have a humanitarian crisis. So that is the immediate thing. But there is also another important thing, and that's the benefits upgrade. Benefits need to be upgraded in line with inflation, and that upgrade should be brought forward. So not wait until April, but actually make sure that people can benefit from that during the winter. The other point that is very important is to make sure that people know what they are entitled to. We have seen, and it's been covered in the media in the recent days, for example, the energy contribution for those on prepaid meters. A lot of people are not aware that they are entitled to that. And again, that's something that needs to be made sure that people know that there are things that they're entitled to. So ensuring that people access the benefits they're entitled to, the energy discount, combined with humanitarian relief, and ensuring that people have something to eat over the winter.
Thank you very much. Deputy Mayor, my next question is for you. As you are aware, I launched my report Growing Hungry 2 weeks ago. I would like to ask you what the Mayor's office and what you are doing through your agency in terms of preventing food banks from running out of food, which is a very real risk at the moment. And we saw what happened during the pandemic and lockdowns. And if you could be brief, please. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. And yes, congratulations on the publication of your report, Marina. As you rightly indicated, at the start of the pandemic, there was a situation where food banks in London were running out of food. And a lot of the situation which drove that was the fact that donations were down, people were self-isolating, and the demand was increasing on those food banks, largely because people couldn't access delivery slots from supermarkets, etc. So as a result of that, we set up the food aid subgroup as part of the London Food Board. And it's a group of food aid organisations and welfare organisations who run food banks in our city. And they meet regularly to ensure that they are working closely with local authorities to make sure that they don't run out of food, and that local authorities can support them should they be at risk of doing so. As part of that work, and as part of the work of the Food Board, there is a regular food insecurity survey that we conduct, where we ask all of the food aid organisations in London across all of the boroughs whether there are any situations that we need to be made aware of, that local authorities need to be made aware of, and they tell us helpfully whether there are any situations. Now, at the moment, they are not reporting any situations, but I am completely clear and aware, given what Klara has said, that is likely to change, and so we will ensure through that food insecurity survey that we are in regular touch with them, so that as soon as we know that there is an issue, we can stand up resources, as we did back in the pandemic when we worked so successfully with local authorities and civil society to address those gaps.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And the next question is from Assemblymember Bukhari.
Thank you, Chair. This is to the Deputy Mayor. Now, we know that London is actually not as fair and as equal as it could be, and as a third of Londoners are living in poverty. And you were talking about those many Londoners that aren't accessing the benefits and the rights that they should have. So my question is this, why we really need to make sure the cost of living hub is actually working. And my question is this. We got support in the London Assembly to do a fully costed building safety crisis support hub for leaseholders that was supported by leaseholders. It was overturned because of cost and overturned because of staffing. And yet the Mayor's reaction, which was quite a quick reaction to the cost of living emergency, was to set up a similar hub. So the building safety hub that was supported by leaseholders, that would be fully costed, that the audience was targeted and actually wanted it. I want to know what discussions the Mayor had with the stakeholders before reaching the conclusion that the cost of living hub was the right response to this emergency.
So the Mayor's decision to set up the cost of living hub was one that we recommended that he do. I have responsibility for supporting low-income Londoners and minority ethnic groups, as you're aware. So my advice to him to set up the hub was principally because I knew that we needed something that people could access. We knew that civil society organisations were in agreement that this was something that they knew was needed. So
was there any conversation with stakeholders beforehand?
Yes, there was. There was. So, and everything that we do in relation to poverty eradication, tackling inequalities, we do in conjunction with the VCS, we do in conjunction with funders, we do in conjunction with those who are working on the front line. So we spoke to the VCS or to civil society organisations to make sure that what we were setting up was something that was useful for them, because they are the ones who need to signpost people to the hub on our behalf to make sure that people are aware of it.
And
so
an
in relation to your previous, the other hub that you mentioned, unfortunately, I don't know much about that hub, so I can't really.
Well, it was a fully costed hub that had support from all leaseholders who wanted it. But the concern I have is that when we mentioned the cost of living hub to stakeholders, particularly those who are actually supporting people who are going through energy cost crisis in a recent environment committee that we had no idea about the cost of living hub. So that was the problem. I don't think it was actually an idea that was thought about at great length. It was a knee-jerk reaction from the Mayor to deal with this situation.
So I'm going to pass on to Tom, because his team obviously have worked on this. It definitely wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. We knew from as early as the end of last year that we needed to do something specifically around tackling the cost of living crisis. We do have an issue, and I think this is an issue with regards to any kind of hub, in making sure that it gets out to Londoners. You have to do the hard work and the outreach, and you have to engage with the organisations. And many of the organisations that we have engaged with have been organisations in the poverty reduction space. and those community-based organisations who are supporting low-income Londoners from a range of groups. We are also increasing the way in which we work with those environment organisations that you referred to. I would be happy to have a conversation with any of those stakeholders if that would be helpful, to make sure that they're as aware of what we're doing, because it can't work unless we're working in conjunction with them. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Tom.
Thanks, Debbie. Just to add briefly, the partners that have been working with have not just been in terms of the idea and whether or not that's a good thing, but actually the team which sits within my unit to produce and kind of then oversee the hub have worked through the process in terms of actually the development of its content. Has not just been done by a team within the GLA, but has been done with, as Debbie says, kind of civil society partners working to support Londoners of low income, advice providers, a whole range. And if it's helpful, I can happily provide details to the Assembly about the partners that we've worked with. That is, of course, in no way the same way. So we've worked with every civil society partner in the development of that hub, but it has not just been in the idea, but actually the generation of the content and actually the maintenance of that content has been something that we have done very consciously in partnership, in kind of co-production with partners across London. And as Debbie says, the task that we have now, I think, is both making sure that the content remains relevant, remains up to date. You know, Torsten set out some of the challenges that will change over the coming, but also in terms of the promotion, we continue to work with both borough partners, but also civil society in terms of making sure.
Okay, can you remind me very quickly how much does it cost, the cost of living hub?
Our budget for the cost of living hub over the course of this year was £150,000 for its development and launch, and then maintenance. And
you're doing measuring the impact by unique page views, is that right?
So I suppose there's data that sits underneath that. The headline measure is about how many people are accessing and using.
Yeah. And so have you assessed how many refugees, single parents, disabled Londoners, older Londoners are using it?
So the way in which the data for a website works is we would not be able to get that data through the analytics.
Yeah, so again, we're talking about missing groups that we were talking about before. And how do we know that the cost of living hub is actually reaching those people? And this is my main concern.
Is it okay to come in? Yeah. So I think one of the things that's important, and I kind of indicated this when I made my opening statement, is that we have to recognise that there are particular groups of individuals for whom a hub would work, and there are particular groups of people for whom a hub would not work. And so the hub is not the only answer that we have to the cost of living crisis.
There's another concern that you were talking about the digitally excluding that you want to do face-to-face. So how are we paying for that? Is that an additional cost? Because if they can't reach the hub, are you going to pay for more staff to do the face-to-face as well? Do we have any figures about that?
No. So we have a programme of work, of cost of living work. We spent around £5 million, which includes the cost of living hub, but it also includes funding to advice-providing organisations in London so that they can do that face-to-face work with individuals who, frankly, would not be best served by a hub. So there are people who like the hub. There are people who, for all sorts of reasons, would feel happier and easier by accessing information online, and we have to make sure that that service is available. But we've also spent £2.3 million on the London Citizens Advice and the London Legal Support Trust, who are advice-giving organisations in London who we know can give advice on welfare.
Can you guarantee me that anyone's missing out? Can you guarantee me that no one is missing out?
No, all I can say to you is that the work that we have done so far on advice has benefited the individuals who we know are hardest hit by poverty. So we have had black individuals and Asian individuals who have been, disproportionately affected by poverty, but they are also the ones who are benefiting from our advice work. Women in particular, particularly women with children, are also those who are disproportionately affected by poverty, but also are the ones who are coming to us for advice. So we are doing the targeted work.
Okay.
And so I won't say to you at this point we're going to make sure we cover every single individual, but we are targeting.
Let's talk about how we could do
but
this.
We are targeting the ones who we know are the ones who are more likely to be living in poverty at the moment.
So
and those are the
I'm
individuals
going to move on to Klara and Torsten, because there is a way we can make sure that nobody misses out, and that's through a basic income. I'd like to get an idea from you guys about whether you think this is actually something that could happen. And I understand that the Mayor has actually joined the London Liberal Democrats in signing an open letter to the Prime Minister advocating universal basic income and actually doing a trial. So do you think this is a good idea?
I think what we would need to see is the results of the trial. At the moment, what we are focusing on is living wage. And that's something that we know works. It's been tried and tested. It's linked to cost of living. So I don't have at the moment any information about that trial. But certainly this is the sort of thing that, at the Trust, we are always interested in piloting new ideas and innovative ways to deal with poverty. What we know that trials have been tried elsewhere, so it's always a question of let's see how it could work
and it's happening in Wales right now.
What it can do, but at the moment that's not something we are actively looking at. We're investing quite a lot of resources to the London Living Wage campaign, and that's our priority focus at the moment.
Torsten?
So the question of the desirability or otherwise of a universal basic income is a big question, and it's a long-term question. The cost of living crisis is happening to everybody right now, and if your answer to that is to pilot with a few people a small-scale UBI, then it's not remotely at the races in terms of an adequate answer. So if you want a long-term focus on a UBI, I've got big, strong views on both sides. There are advantages, there are disadvantages. The main disadvantage is it's never going to happen. Yeah. But but if you want to focus on what's happening to lower-income households right now, you should spend your time worrying about the uprating of earnings of benefits that's happening this April and that will matter for millions of Londoners. You should worry about debt advice provision that's being delivered via citizen advice and other things that actually matter. And you should worry about rents and what's happening in the private rented sector. And if you spend your time talking about a UBI, you'll be spending your time arguing for a pilot, spending years doing that when you could have been getting on with delivering real change for Londoners right now.
Okay, Torsten, that the Liberal Democrats are out of time now, so you don't need to carry on on that issue.
I'll finish.
Thank you. The next question is from Assembly Member Garrett.
Morning everyone. Morning, Deputy Mayor. So, as the Chair mentioned at the top of this meeting, London Assembly is the voice of London, composed of 25 members elected at the same time as the Mayor to hold him to account and scrutinise his policies. And yet again, he's not here. He's actually down in Cornwall on a sort of waffle shop, jolly conference. Do you think that's the right priority for the Mayor this morning, Debbie?
I would hope that everyone would be happy that I'm here. Answering questions, and also given that the cost of living is within my remit and I have the responsibility for advising the Mayor on this work, it probably was more advantageous for me to be here. So I'm hoping that you're happy that I'm here to answer questions.
It's certainly advantageous to the Mayor, because what of course he likes to do is go on media and grandstand, but then he doesn't really like to be scrutinised about what he is or isn't doing. So last night, he was there. It was nice of him to turn up to people's question time. There were a series of questions from people in the audience, echoing comments that I've had, which are both obvious to anyone who looks at the issue and certainly obvious to anyone here who receives email from constituents, concerned about the impact of the ULEZ expansion, which the Mayor is proposing from August. Do you have a view on the cost of living impact that policy is going to have?
So I know that there is a consultation that has been out, and the Mayor will be making a decision on the basis of that. I think from my perspective, there's two things. The first is that we're clearly in a cost of living crisis, but we are also in a climate crisis. And the Mayor had a number of alternatives which were presented to him. And the expansion, the ULEZ expansion that you're referring to, was the one which would have had the least financial impact out of all of the alternatives on Londoners. I think the additional thing to say on this is that the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis is having a disproportionate impact on particular communities.
Sorry, you're talking about the climate crisis in relation to ULEZ. You understand that the integrated impact assessment on the ULEZ expansion to Outer London says that it will have nil impact on carbon emissions, carbon levels, and therefore on climate change.
ULEZ and all of these initiatives that the Mayor is developing are
one initiative. I don't want you to broaden it out to everything.
Are principally about tackling air pollution. And one of the issues that we faced in our city is that there are particular communities who are more likely to experience air pollution than others. And so the Mayor has to be very clear about trying to ensure he's doing all he can to ensure that those individuals are protected from air pollution. We do know that low-income Londoners and those from particular minority ethnic groups are those most likely to live in areas of London with high levels of air pollution. So I suppose the issue from my perspective, and I speak as an individual who has responsibility for poverty reduction but also for equalities, is that both of these issues are an equality issue. I don't think it would be right for the Mayor to stand by and allow individuals from particular communities to be those who are most likely to suffer from air pollution, in the same way that he can't sit by and allow those who are most likely to be at risk from poverty to experience it. So this is his way of trying to do both of those things.
Okay. I mean, firstly, I just want to underline the fact that the entire conversation about climate change is not relevant to the ULEZ expansion. The point about disproportionate impact, I mean, there's a section, I assume you're familiar with it. So Appendix E at the end of the Integrated Impact Assessment talks about the likely impact on protected characteristics. The appendix is called Impacts on Protected Characteristic Groups of the ULEZ expansion. And it goes through how, for example, on both older people and younger people, there'll be moderate or minor negative impacts. On disabled people, that's a well-rehearsed argument about people who find it more difficult to use public transport, how they rely on their cars, often with adapted cars, which it's difficult to replace with a new car. It talks about how, for similar reasons, ethnic minority people who live in so poorer parts of London who are more likely to suffer air pollution, also more likely if they have cars to own older cars. So it's a much more nuanced conversation. If you look at this appendix, you see it's a much more nuanced conversation than this idea that it is necessary to push ahead with this policy. So do you not see that the impact that has on those less well-off Londoners, who are the people who, if they own a car, are more likely to own an older car? I mean, it's just impossible to see how they afford £12.50 a day. I mean, you must recognise that.
So I do know that once the Mayor makes a decision on the basis of the consultation.
Well, he's not here, so it doesn't matter what he thinks. I'm asking you what you think,
well,
since you are here.
I'm here I represent the Mayor, so obviously I will speak in support of his decision once he does make it. Once he does make the decision based on the consultation, and I know that there is a separate analysis that's being conducted on the consultation responses, one of the things that is incredibly important is that he will ensure that he can provide the most feasible scrappage scheme for individuals who own a car that is non-ULEZ compliant. But I do think it's also really important to recognise that those who are on the lowest incomes in our city do not own cars.
Sorry, that isn't true. I have to interrupt.
Those on the lowest incomes do not own cars.
Wrong.
Sorry,
before you use up all of my available time with incorrect information, so that we asked the Mayor about this fact, which he claims frequently. He sent us in response what I would characterise as garbage. So I went to the Office for National Statistics and I asked them for the figures, and I have them here. So for gross household income, London households with a gross household income of less than 11,856, which is not a wealthy household, there's the lowest decile in the ONS scale, 26% of those households own a car. And you go up a little bit to households with a gross household income of 17,420 to 23,000, 49% of those households in London own a car. So these are not wealthy households. These are the bottom and third bottom decile by gross household income in London. Quite a lot of them, between a quarter and about half, own a car. And disproportionately, you must recognise, these are not people driving around in shiny new Teslas. This is where you find people in 15, 20-year-old cars, because that's the car they can afford. The Mayor is making it impossible for them to continue to use their car, and he is at a time when it is incredibly expensive to replace it. So do you not recognise the impact on those people?
No. So I will reinforce what I said earlier, which is that I know that the Mayor does plan, once he makes his announcement, he does plan to ensure that there is a scrappage scheme available to individuals on the lowest income. So those individuals who are claiming particular benefits, so those are the ones who are the lowest income.
We all know most of these people are going to get no support.
As well as individuals who are disabled, to be able to adapt their vehicles or buy new vehicles and give them the finances that they need to be able to do so. I think what's really important, and I do have to stress this, because I'm obviously listening very clearly to what you're saying about cost. We are in a cost of living crisis, but at the same time as being in a cost of living crisis, we do know that air pollution levels in our city are high. So we have to make sure that when we make decisions about trying to support and protect individuals, that we are supporting and protecting individuals as much as we can, both in relation to income, but also in relation to health. And there are clear relationships between being on a low income and having a poor health outcome.
But what
so
the mayor
it's
is proposing is to
incredibly
spend,
important for us to be able to do both, and the ULEZ. And the plan for the ULEZ is his way of doing both of those things.
It's not helping any of these people. So the ULEZ is £250 million on a camera network, which will disproportionately impact those less well-off people who own cars. And that money could be spent on many of the other things that we will hear about this morning that money could be spent on. He's spending it on a camera network. And you and I both know the vast majority of those low-income Londoners with cars will get the square root of sod all support to replace their car.
I don't know that. I don't know that at all.
Well,
I don't know that at all, and I would never say something like that.
I'm sure the mayor will be back here very soon when he eventually announces his policy, and we'll find out. It's notable that neither you nor he nor anyone else has any number for that scrappage scheme. So all of the talk is about what he's going to do with the camera network. He has committed £0 and 0 pence to a scrappage scheme.
We can't
and he's already blaming the government for it being undersized.
Okay, so we can't announce the scrappage scheme until the decision is made, and he does have finances for the scrappage scheme.
Well, I look forward to hearing about that.
And I think you will also remember that there was a scrappage scheme associated with ULEZ previously.
There was, and it ran out quickly, and it was inadequate.
The scrappage scheme was sufficient at that time for those individuals.
It was not. It was not.
Okay,
Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Okay, look, Assembly Member, you asked a question. The Deputy Mayor's answered. Let's move on. The next question is from Assembly Member Polensky.
Thank you very much, Chair. At the risk of extending the conversation about who and who isn't here, and I'm delighted we've got the panel we have, I do want to express disappointment that we don't have a Minister for London. We know we're talking about a cost of living crisis, but this is really an income crisis, an inequality crisis, and we know the effects that this is having on Londoners, so I do think it's negligent to not be here. But I want to move on because I want to thank the guests that are here. Torsten, can I begin with you? There's been a lot of discussion, particularly in the media and from the government, around the financial black hole. And that's led to very familiar conversations about treating finances like household budgets or debits on credit cards. And it's starting to feel like it's setting the table for austerity 2.0. What lessons do you think there are for London from the last 12 years of Conservative government in how to run finances responsibly?
That's a big question. So I'll offer a number of reflections. So the big picture reflection is that Britain as a whole has got poorer. Okay, that is what a global energy shock, driven particularly through gas markets, means for an energy importing country, which is what we are. And so a lot of the subsets of what we're discussing at the moment, views on public spending levels, views on taxation levels, views on energy support, views on wages, profit levels, all of those are subsets of a wider question, which is the country has become poorer. How do we wish to distribute the pain that causes? What's the balance between employers paying it and workers paying it? That's why you're going to see more strikes happening over the course of this year than you've seen in recent past, because that's what happens when you're in a high inflation environment, and everyone needs to kind of calm down about that. That's just the world as it exists in the real world. And similarly, the choices on tax and public spending become more acute in an era where the country is becoming poorer, because that is actually a subset of deciding, do we want to become poorer by having worse public services, or do we want to become poorer by paying more taxes and having lower private levels of consumption? Now, within that, then, there are lots of important choices to make about how well you do that. So most obviously, you need to take into account the very real distributional effects of an energy shock. And so the job of policymakers is to make sure those most acutely affected by that cost of living shock, those on lower incomes who have a higher energy bills, they need to be protected from it. And then when it comes to your views on the balance between public spending and taxation, then given that this is a country that's just been through 10 years of austerity, the idea that it's going to be as easy to cut public spending now as it was in 2010 is for the birds. It's much easier to cut it at the beginning of a period of austerity than it is at the end of it. And so that's why when the Chancellor's looking at the package that he has to announce on the 17th, then I think it is inevitable, if that's to be a remotely credible package, that tax will need to play a much bigger part than I think is part of the conversation. Now, you're then setting that within a wider context, which is on the macroeconomics of this. Do we need to balance the books? I have an annoyingly nuanced view. I know some people want to say, like, it's all about filling the hole right now, and then another load of people want to say there's no such thing as a fiscal constraint. Have you met MMT? I've got my like macro conspiracy theory. I'm afraid countries do face financial constraints. They're not the same constraints as household budgets at all, but they do face financial constraints. I think the really important thing to understand is that today is not the same macroeconomic environment as we faced in 2010. And most importantly, that's because you've got an independent central bank that is raising interest rates because it's saying to us the economy is operating at full capacity. Now, it doesn't matter whether we agree with them or not, okay? If that is their judgment, and we've decided that they're an independent central bank, that means that if we try to use fiscal policy to boost the economy, which we should be doing for distributional reasons when it comes to the energy package, they will raise interest rates by more than they otherwise would to try and squeeze out that support for the economy, to make sure it doesn't grow any faster because they're worried about the effect on inflation. So in that environment, the trade-offs are more real. And the second reason the trade-offs are more real is because our balance of payments deficit is huge because we're importing gas, and gas has just got more expensive. And that's another way of saying the UK, which is always borrowing from abroad in the recent past, needs to do a lot more of that right now. So don't be flippant about the fact that we do face real financial constraints, and they are more acute now than they were in 2010 when interest rates were going down, not up. Large amounts of QE was taking place. That is not the world we live in. The central bank is trying to sell assets and is trying to raise interest rates right now. But that doesn't mean that we should be gung-ho, given that there's on the scale of consolidation, because it's very uncertain. We have estimates of what we think the consolidation required is. The OBR is going to give the government its one on the 17th and explain to all of us. All of us providing those kind of estimates should be very honest about the scale of uncertainty involved. And so I think you don't want to go totally overboard and say, I definitely need to do an absolutely huge consolidation right now on the basis that we don't know what the long-term situation is. I can't tell you what geopolitics is going to do to gas prices. That's the thing that's going to drive the depth of the recession that's going to happen next year.
Can I just focus us in there? So I really appreciate the nuance. I think there was a lot in that answer because it was a big question. I think we're in danger of learning some of the wrong answers from this crisis, so particularly around borrowing. Now, borrowing for unfunded tax cuts is clearly not desirable. Yeah. Borrowing for investment and green investment in particular, I think, is somewhere we should be going. So on the point of tax cuts, Green Party policy is actually for a wealth tax, so a 1% tax on the wealthiest 1%, which would raise about £75 billion a year. Now, what do you think a wealth tax would mean for Londoners, particularly if it could open big money to make sure we're insulating every home, for instance, that needs it? And what difference would that make, particularly for poorer Londoners?
So to take those elements in turn, Britain does need to have a higher level of public investment than it has maintained for lots of the last few decades, particularly the 1990s, when basically Britain decided to do zero public investment. There's a case that's needed for public services. It's needed to support growth. Public investment obviously supports science and R&D spending as well, and it is important for net zero. And there is no route to plausibly staying on target for our net zero ambitions in the 2020s without significant public investment driving our retrofitting programme in particular. So that is completely right, and there is no alternative to that. Low-income households are not going to retrofit their homes. Their incomes are far too low given the costs that are required to do that, even before we start putting in the heat pumps, just to get the insulation in. They can't. So you need that to happen, and we need whatever consolidation plans the government comes forward with not to make that impossible. And so we shouldn't treat that kind of spending differently. Now, separately, that I agree, we do need to see tax taking a lot of the burden of some of the difficult choices that are happening in the near future. Within that space, I think moving to a net wealth tax is, again, not going to happen in the foreseeable future and brings with it all kinds of design considerations. I would, again, focus on things that plausibly can happen in the wealth tax space, which should be, and the big picture, remember, the reason why wealth should be doing more work in the taxation space is because wealth, even though incomes haven't grown in Britain very fast over the last 15 years, wealth has been growing pretty much non-stop since the 1980s. Which is largely through asset price accumulation, which is basically housing, some pension increases too. The taxation that falls on that growing household wealth has been zero. So with around 5% of GDP being benefiting in tax from wealth taxes, no growth despite the the wealth to GDP ratio going from about 3 to about 8 times over the course of that time. So yes, we should. Within that space, you should be focusing on capital gains taxes, particularly on allowances and on the rates and on a lot of the exemptions, which are completely indefensible. Within the inheritance tax space, it's completely mad. Not in London because you haven't got many fields, but we exempt. Why does Dyson own lots of fields? Because they're inheritance tax exempt, right? It's not because he loves fields, it's because he'd like to not pay inheritance tax, and you don't pay inheritance tax if you're a farmer, which I promise you Mr. Dyson is not. So there are lots of things in the wealth tax space we should get on with. Similarly on property taxation, I've got a long list of things we should definitely be doing. We should be doing all of those, and all of those are much easier to do than trying to introduce a net wealth tax.
Thank you very much, and particularly around your support for wealth taxes. London is one of the most prosperous cities in the world, and the fact we've got a cost of living crisis is shameful. These are political choices. Deputy Mayor, if I can move on to you, it's picking up from what Torsten was saying there, particularly around poorer Londoners are not going to retrofit their own homes without support, and I think we definitely agree on that. I want to look at communal heating systems as an aspect of that. Now, people living in these buildings do not benefit from the energy price cap, and sometimes they're having quite steep rises with 10 times the previous sum. What steps does the government need to do to take control of this outrageous situation of communal heating to make sure that people are supported?
So this is something that was raised by Tom Copley. I chair a monthly cost of living working group which has representation from different deputy mayors from across the building, and Tom raised with me at that point the issue of communal heating, and he I believe is about to write, I think he was going to write to the government to say that this was something which was unfeasible, and that he would need to see some changes on, because I guess it's one of those, there are many issues which, when we're talking about the way in which people can access benefits or access support, there are so many that fall through those cracks, and communal heating, those living in those properties are the ones who tend to fall between those cracks. So I can assure you it's something that that Tom Copley, as Deputy Mayor for Housing, is acutely aware of, and is hoping to develop develop conversations with government about ways that they can work together to try to address it.
Thank you. If I can move now to the lifeline tariff that the Mayor announced. Now, I'm really interested in this policy. It feels like it draws on some good green thinking and has that kind of systemic approach. Now, we need to ensure energy costs are fair, and this policy goes some way to making sure that would be implemented. But what steps have been actually taken to consider how feasible this approach would be, and how would you see a policy being put in place if it got support?
Okay, so on the lifeline tariff, I'm unfortunately going to have to do that thing which I know many of you in this room do not like me doing, or anyone doing, which is that I'm going to have to defer to the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, Shirley Rodriguez, because this is something that she has advised the Mayor that he needs to ask for. So any developmental work around it is something that her team would have responsibility for. So I'm sure she could give you some further detail on what she's doing on that.
I think that's a fair response. With my final few minutes, I just want to turn on to a slightly different topic. Now, we often talk about these short-term fixes that we need for the cost of living crisis, and I totally get that many people in London and around the UK are really feeling it right now, so it is totally correct that we protect the most vulnerable. I do think we need those long-term visions as well. And for the years that I've been elected to the Assembly in the last 2, I've been talking about universal basic income repeatedly, bringing motions to it, and thank you for the time that you've spent with me. This comes off a long tradition of Greens in the Assembly and nationally talking about universal basic income. We've been banging on about it for decades, and we will not stop until we get there. Now, I know an easy solution is to say we need short-term fixes, and I agree with that, which is why I'm not acknowledging that up front. But we also need that long-term vision and strategy. Now, the thing that's changed since we've last had this conversation is Andy Burnham, Manchester Mayor, is now talking about universal basic income a lot. I was about to say proportional representation. He's talking about that too, which is great. But he's talking about universal basic income. Is the Mayor working with him on this to make sure that we can get a universal basic income in London?
It was rightly pointed out that the Mayor has signed a joint letter that Andy Burnham and others have signed around asking the government to consider funding a pilot. I think the issue for me is that we know that were a pilot of this nature to take place in London, it would be an incredibly costly pilot, and it's something that we definitely would need additional support to be able to fund to do. And I suspect that this is part of the reason why the Mayor signed the letter and why so many individuals signed the letter to ask the government if they would consider funding a pilot of this nature. I am, though, as you will know, because we have had this conversation, I am very concerned about those who are on the lowest incomes right now. And yes, we do have to have long-term solutions. I do still feel that the welfare system is where a lot of this reform could feasibly take place. We have a welfare system in our country which is supposed to provide a safety net for those on the lowest incomes, those who fall on hard times, those who are unable to work for whatever reason. And unfortunately, we have a system where around, certainly last year in London, there were around £2 billion of means-tested benefits that went unclaimed. So we do need to do more to ensure that those on the lowest incomes are making claims for what they rightly should be claiming in order to maximise their incomes. And in the short term, I do strongly believe that the uprating of benefits in line with inflation, the increasing awareness for those on lowest incomes of what they are entitled to is one of the best ways to try to ensure that those who are at risk of destitution, frankly, are able to get through this winter. As far as UBI, however, is concerned, funding a pilot is something that we should look into and think about. Anything at all that can help low-income Londoners be able to avoid poverty is important.
I really appreciate that amount of time, so sorry to interrupt, but the Mayor's own research shows it will lift hundreds of thousands of Londoners out of poverty, so I'll join you in lobbying the government. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Assembly Member Leonie Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I'd actually like to come to Torsten. Thank you for your analysis at the top in terms of setting out all the different areas. And my colleague, Assembly Member Ahmad, has already asked a bit about food. I'd like to talk a bit about energy. One of the initiatives from the government, which was incredibly welcome, was the energy price guarantee, but that's only for 6 months. And also it's not very targeted. I've just received it, for example, and my house is very well insulated, so I'm not sure I really need it. Would you like to see it continue from April next year, and do you think it should be on a more targeted basis? And if so, how should that targeting be constructed?
Okay, so the challenge we've got here is that we're wrestling with a number of overlapping constraints. Okay, so the challenge we've got is we've got energy prices which are uncertain, but on current market levels are too high for even middle-income households to afford. We've got the fiscal pressures that Zach was raising just now, and we've got this interaction between monetary and fiscal policy where they're worried about too much fiscal support going into the economy at a time when inflation is already high. Okay, now the textbook answer to an energy shock like this is to just give money to the households on lower incomes so that they can pay those energy bills. And in general, and I agree with that textbook in general and the reasons why the textbooks say that, rather than the kind of approach that the energy price guarantee represents, which is to cap the actual cost of the energy for households. I think the challenge we've got in the real world, rather than in some kind of nirvana, is that the price level of the energy is now so high that the means test using the benefit system to provide that income support just basically won't work, because too many middle-income households who aren't on benefits now won't be able to afford their energy bills. And also, as you'll all be aware, lots of lower-income households are not on benefits, either because they don't claim, as Debbie was raising just now, but actually in lots of cases because they're not entitled to benefits in the first place. Particularly single people will, in lots of cases, not be entitled to benefits even though they are very poor. So given that, and then given something else which doesn't get discussed enough, I hear people saying all the time, oh, rich households use more energy than poorer households, which is obviously blindingly obviously true because you know, rich people have bigger houses, so no shit Sherlock, okay? But the interesting question is not the variation really across the income distribution. That's a couple of £100 between the poorest households and the richest households. The important variation for policymakers designing policy in this very difficult circumstances is there's a lot of variation in energy usage within the income deciles. So if you just look at the poorest poorer households. You see big variation going from a kind of mid-hundreds of pounds for very small properties with maybe one person living in it up to £4,000, £4,500 energy bills even before this rise for people in very leaky properties. Those aren't generally in London, but they could. Some of them will be. So big variation. And so the danger we've got is that if we continue with the approach we were using before the EPG, which remember was lump sum payments targeted at those on benefits, which I support in general, we're giving lump sum payments to the household irrespective of how much they're being hit by those higher energy bills, irrespective of how bad their boiler is. So all I would say is, if you don't, you should. There are aspects of the EPG you shouldn't like. The non-targeting is making it very expensive. There are the alternatives, insofar as the government has come forward with proposals in the past, was lump sum payments targeted via the benefit system. That is also not fit for purpose unless, and I think that's where the government's likely to go on the 17th next year, saying we're not going to have the EPG, we're going to have more targeted payments. If we do that, that will only work basically if we get lucky and energy prices fall. If we don't get lucky and the geopolitics means that gas prices stay high, German industry isn't as good as we currently think at coping without Russian gas, so energy prices next year are remaining high, then that will not be fit for purpose.
OK, I'm going to have to ask you to be a lot briefer because both Assemblymember Bukhari and Polanski used up the time for 5 people with their questions, whereas we're going to split it between all of us and other people want to talk about other things. So given what you've just said, do you think that the government should be I mean, the reason why I said at the beginning I don't need assistance as much is because I've done a lot of insulation and improvements to my property, but because I'm a sustainability person and so I want to reduce energy costs that way. So should we be ramping up insulation programmes both to help people permanently reduce their bills, but also in terms of what we can do for employment as well?
Yes, we should.
On a point of order, Chair, the Assembly member has just asserted that other Assembly members have used other people's time. I don't believe that to be the case.
Sorry, the group. They've used up their time from their group. We have the allocation.
Hang on. Look.
Well, they did.
Hang on. The Assembly members, the Assembly groups are given time.
Yes.
It's up to them to choose how they want to distribute it. If the Labour group wants to distribute 6 minutes to each member, that's up to them. If they want to use one of them, that's up to them. I don't think they've got more time than they should have been.
They haven't taken more time than they should, Chair, and I wasn't trying to imply that. It's just the previous 3 people have just had
this is coming off your
and
time now, Leonie.
Well, I'd like you to give it back because, well, OK, I'm going to be taking 10 minutes the same as all the people who just spoke. It's just that I don't have as much time available to me, and I'd like you to remove the intervention from Assemblymember Boff, thank you, from my time. Can we go back to the question which I was asking, which is about ramping up insulation programmes, which we stopped from 2010 onwards, so we're now a lot further back than we would have been. Is that something we should be doing to permanently reduce energy bills and also in terms of employment? Is it helpful in both of those ways?
It's something we should definitely have been doing, and in particular since 2013, in fact, is where the drop-off comes in home insulations. Then yes, that is a catastrophe. We should have been doing it then. We should have been doing it in 2014. We should have been doing it in 2015. We should be doing it in 2022. And we should be doing it in 2023. And we are not at the races. And in particular, again, if you want to focus on areas, the bits that we're doing okay in the social rented sector. We've got a catastrophe in the sense that we have a policy notionally, nationally on the private rented sector, but no implementation mechanism, i.e. we're telling landlords they have to have done it in a few years, but nothing's happening at all. And on homeowners, it's happening for rich homeowners, but it's not happening for poorer homeowners, and it's not going to happen without major intervention. So we should get on with it. On the employment benefits, those are overdone, because really what we're here talking about isn't extra jobs, it's that we need to move people from doing other things. And we have, as I say, only 4% unemployment, but it's about what jobs people are doing.
Into these jobs. Could I just move on to Klara very briefly? Obviously, one of the arguments there is about putting some public resource into this. Do you believe that the government should come up with an alternative to the Green Homes Grant Scheme, which obviously has been a complete failure, to help us move forward on this area so that Londoners are not paying massive bills for leaky homes?
I'm afraid this is not really an area that Trust for London is working on at the moment. So I think somebody else will be better qualified than me to answer the question. But one thing that I will point out, though, is there is also a discrepancy between inner London and outer London boroughs. And if you see movement of people who are poorer they tend to move in the outer London boroughs where houses have poor insulation. So I think there is also a very important targeted focus in terms of where these houses are.
Yeah, you need some granular detail on that, but thank you very much for that answer. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The next is Assembly Member Miami.
Thank you, Chair. My question focuses on mortgage rate increases and how that's affecting not just homeowners but a wider range of people. And I'm going to ask you, Torsten, so obviously, well, the Times has reported this morning that both first-time buyers and buy-to-let landlords will be the two groups most impacted by interest rate rises. And obviously that impact on buy-to-let landlords, that's a small cohort, but that force multiplies into a lot of private sector households whose already quite high rents will be further increased as landlords, rightly or wrongly, pass on that cost because they themselves have issues in terms of cost of living. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on how that situation could be supported. There isn't at the moment. We are, Michael Gover's back in DLUC, but we don't have a framework for support for those people at the moment. How would you imagine that Londoners in those circumstances can cope with the large cost of living increase? And I'd really be interested, Klara, as well, if you could comment on that.
So I think the rising mortgage rates is going to be a very big deal, both for the macroeconomy and for individuals over the course of the next few years. We're talking about around 5 million people moving on to 5 million households, moving on to higher mortgages UK-wide over the course of the next 2 years, so by the end of 2024. So it's not the majority, but it's a material subset of the population seeing very high mortgage rises. In London, as I say, it's affecting fewer people, but it's having a bigger effect for those it is affecting because there are fewer mortgages, but they have bigger mortgages when they have them. Within that, I would focus more on worrying about some of the individuals. So the most acutely affected people are those who have recently bought at high house prices and then facing higher interest rates than they were expecting. That's where you get an acute challenge for recent first-time buyers. I would worry less about those on buy-to-lets in the sense that, one, it's not their home, and two, in the end, rent levels aren't determined by the cost of a mortgage from buy-to-let. Individuals can try and pass on those costs. Clearly, in some cases, they'll succeed in doing that when there's a very tight rental market, but it's not mortgage costs that are determining rent levels. It's the supply and demand for rented accommodation. And sometimes people say to me, but it's really a big problem if buy-to-let landlords remove their property. They don't want to rent their property out anymore. This is all complete nonsense. Like, what we care about is the supply and demand for housing. If a buy-to-let landlord decides it's not economic anymore for them to be in that business, the house doesn't disappear. They'll sell it, right? And or someone else will buy it and rent it out. So it doesn't matter for the supply and demand for housing whether someone's a buy-to-let landlord or they're not. So I think that's a complete red herring. I should say that although previous recent first-time buyers should be our worry, because if we do see interest rates doing anything remotely like what is currently forecast, we're talking about the lifetime interest cost for someone who bought recently being double what they thought it was going to be when they purchased. It's not like 10% up, it's double. So it's a lot of money. Now, the only thing I would say is when you're thinking about in the round who are the winners and losers from an interest rate rise, and remember there are always winners. Like, the point of monetary policy is that it's carrying out a distributional change across society to slow the economy down. That is what monetary policy, raising interest rates, is doing. So when you're thinking about it in this context, the losers are clearly the people who already own and have their mortgages going up. One of the winners potentially in the long term is that when interest rates go up, asset prices come down. Okay, that's what's going to happen. If anything like the interest rate rise that's currently forecast happens, we're going to be talking about big house price falls in London. The consensus estimates are in the 10% ballpark. That's like probably best case scenario, I'd have thought. If that happens, then one of the winners are future first-time buyers, because although that it won't change their actual overall costs, which are driven by rent levels, because they have to be equivalising in the end between mortgage costs and rental costs, the deposit is their biggest barrier. And so in the end, a higher interest rate environment and a lower housing price world means a higher home ownership rates. Okay, so that's the long-term benefit possibly. In the short term, you didn't want to buy a house in the last year.
I would also add there is another group of people we must not forget about, and that's those in the shared ownership properties, where they will have higher mortgage rates and increasing rates of rent. So they will be hit potentially from both sides. And I think there is a piece of work to be done with housing associations, for example, that tend to raise the rent in line with inflation. So I think it's important to make sure that this category of people is also included. I think what will be important, going back to the points that Debbie has made, is that people who are suffering as a consequence of rising mortgage rates have access to advice and information. I think debt advice is something that Citizens Advice are already telling us. There is a huge demand for debt advice, and that's going to be absolutely crucial, but also benefits advice, because there may be some assistance available for those who are struggling to pay mortgages. And again, I think it's important that we focus on reinforcing those services and making sure that people actually know about them and go and get that advice. It is very difficult and sometimes very stigmatizing if you have never had to access this sort of advice to do that. So I think there are proactive things that, including housing association, can actually give information to people where they can get that advice. So that is going to be a crucial part of the package.
Okay, and just to follow on from that, I'm really interested in what you say. I spent the summer speaking to housing associations precisely about shared ownership leaseholders who are already, when they are purchasing their homes, are at the limits of what they can afford, and there is a potential crisis, albeit small number of people in London. That is still quite alarming in terms of what will happen to those households for repossessions and homelessness and so on. And I just wonder what your thoughts would be on some coordinated work, as you say, with the housing association sector and the GLA to support those shared owners, so that they don't, in the parlance, become intentionally homeless, and perhaps they may not get to that point, but to make housing associations take more responsibility for those people who are still their residents, whether they're renters or not.
I think a coordinated support on a number of issues is always the best way forward. That you can pull resources if you are collaborating, if you're coordinating. So yeah, I think that would be a good idea as an element of that. But also coordination of access to advice and provision of advice should be part of that, because very often people are falling through the cracks because there is an assumption that somebody else is talking to them or somebody else is doing that. So I think we need to make sure that we are connecting the dots as much as possible.
The next question is from Assemblymember Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. Question for the Deputy Mayor. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. So London is very fortunate in having a significant Tamil community who worked very hard during the pandemic in NHS roles, in care homes, and other key worker roles. Now, members of the community are trying to hold an event in Trafalgar Square in January to mark Tamil Heritage Month, which is one of the most important cultural events in the Tamil calendar. And of course, the Assembly unanimously supported this in a motion I brought last year. But due to the cost of living pressures that the community is facing, there's obviously a knock-on effect on the fundraising necessary to hold this event. So I wrote to you a couple of months ago, I'm sure you remember, asking what support City Hall might be able to give. Followed up on the 10th of October, but I am yet to hear back from you. So I'm wondering if you had an answer to what support the City Hall might give, given the cost of living pressures against the Tamil community.
Thank you so much for your question and for your email. So I have passed this on to my teams. The community engagement team are hoping to reach out to the organisations that you've been referring to, because this is something that we agree we should be seeking to support, and we are working actively, without me making an announcement here before we've been able to finalise everything. We are working actively to see what we can do to enable them to have their event on Trafalgar Square.
I do appreciate that. And is there a sort of timeline by when the groups I'm working with can expect to hear?
As soon as possible. I think it's the best thing I can say.
Great stuff. Well, why don't I follow up with you?
Yes, please do, because there is a lot of work that's been going on in the background, and so we're just trying to finalise everything. But I think we are hopeful that this can happen for them.
Fantastic, thank you very much. If I could move on to another topic then, and actually return to the issue that Assemblymember Garrett was talking about with the ultra-low emission zone. So you mentioned that particular communities are more likely to be impacted by air pollution. I think that's undeniable. But it's, I think, also undeniable that particular communities are more likely to be financially impacted by the effects of ULEZ expansion. I'm thinking particularly of disabled Londoners who will have ULEZ expansion will have an outsized financial impact on them during a cost of living crisis. Disabled Londoners are more likely to rely on their cars to move around the city. Public transport's often inaccessible. Disabled Londoners are also more likely to be living in poverty than other Londoners, even outside of the cost of living crisis. The previous scrappage scheme didn't touch the sides because disabled adaptive vehicles are often significantly more expensive than other vehicles. And this isn't just me speaking. The Jacobs Integrated Impact Assessment said, and I quote, the expansion of ULEZ will make travelling for disabled people unaffordable, resulting in perfectly good vehicles being scrapped with no means of replacing them. And I've had representations from a number of disabled organisations who view this as an existential threat. I think it's fair to say. So I think this is a cost of living issue. It's a social justice issue as well. So what representations have you made to the Mayor on behalf of disabled Londoners regarding the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone?
So I chair a quarterly deaf and disabled people's organisations meeting at which many groups have made representations to me about ULEZ. And I have been in, myself and my teams have been in quite a few conversations with the environment team and others about the need to ensure that disabled people are properly catered to, whatever decision is made by the Mayor ultimately. So I can assure you that I have made a significant number of representations on the behalf of certainly those deaf and disabled organisations who have come to me with their views, and I'm glad that people have come to you also, because I think it's incredibly important that these individuals, this community feels heard and represented. I've been assured that disabled people, once the decision is made, will be accounted for in the decision and in any adaptations that will need to be made to scrappage or to any other support that needs to be provided. So I have received that assurance. And we will wait to see what that looks like once the decision is made.
That's positive to hear. So what kind of, you said you've made representations to make sure disabled people are catered for. What kind of suggestions have you made to the Mayor?
So I suppose to make sure that all of the issues that have been brought to us are taken into consideration. So many of the things that you mentioned about the sorts of vehicles that not deaf and disabled people, but certain disabled people with certain disabilities have, the sorts of vehicles that they have, the carers who drive them about and look after them, that all of these are taken into consideration when the final decision is made. And also, and in addition to that, I've made sure that in the meetings that I've held the quarterly meetings, that all of the groups represented who have come to those meetings have had an opportunity themselves to speak directly to the team working specifically on ULEZ expansion and the alternatives. So I've made sure that they've had opportunities to speak, to talk about this very specific issues, and we will wait to see what the final decision is and what the impact will be for them in terms of the adaptations that are.
Have you made representations about scrappage schemes specifically?
Yes.
To say that it should take into account that disabled adaptive vehicles are often more expensive.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, all of those things, and to make sure that that the groups that we have spoken to have been part of the process throughout the entire period, and that they were given enough opportunities to respond to the consultation. So all of those things, yes. So.
That's good to hear. And you mentioned to my colleague that the Mayor has the finances for a scrappage scheme. So could you let us know how much he's set aside for that?
I cannot. I'm sorry.
Is that because you don't have the figures, or because for some other reason?
No, it's because it's not the area that I work in. So I would have to have you have the environment team give you that information.
Do you agree that because disabled people are are very worried about
Sure,
this, as you
absolutely.
know.
Yeah.
One of the ways the Mayor could ease their concerns is to announce what the scrappage scheme might look like if ULEZ expansion was to go ahead. And if he has put aside money, there should surely not be that much stopping him from doing so.
I think, to be fair to the teams that are working on this, I think it would be premature to talk about a scrappage scheme before the final decision has been made, because obviously you don't want to start talking about how much is in it or what it's going to look like before the decision.
I think it would be a significant reassurance, not just to disabled Londoners, but to many Londoners who'll be impacted by this. But I'm out of time, so I'll move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure Assembly members would want to join me in welcoming children from the school, from St. Joseph Camberwell School. Welcome to Question Time. Nice to see you here. What? Right. The next question is from Assembly Member Grupesh Hirani.
Thank you, Chair. And my question is to Dr. Debbie Weeks. Bernard, welcome to all the panellists as well. So the cost of living crisis is also a health crisis, and it risks profoundly exacerbating the health inequalities that were rapidly exposed over the COVID-19 period and still affect us today. We've heard already from Klara from Trust for London about malnutrition, and also her view on increasing benefits in line with inflation. And indeed, Debbie, you gave your view on this. So will you also now join me in writing to the government to urge them to adopt a health in all policies approach, and again ask them to look at ensuring that benefits rise in line with inflation, given the link between the cost of living crisis and health outcomes?
Absolutely. I think that there is a very clear link between being on a low income and the impact on health inequalities. It's something that we certainly saw at the start of the pandemic. We know that those who were most severely impacted by it were those who were living on some of the lowest incomes, or those who were working on some of the lowest paid public-facing roles. So there is a very clear link between the two, and I'd be very happy to join you in writing to the government to ensure that all of the policies that they develop have health at its heart, given the way in which it's likely to impact some of our most vulnerable communities.
Thank you for that commitment. And just to turn to Klara, how disappointed were you to find out that the government's health disparities white paper was to be delayed? And how vital do you think that it is that they do not abandon this approach?
I think health inequality is an apparent issue, and one of the things that we are focusing on specifically is around funding more work around advice, which again is linked to your point on benefits. And I think that's that is a key point there, that people actually not only have access to benefits, but that those benefits are operated in line with inflation. I'm afraid I'm not an expert on health inequalities, and it's not one of the priorities that we currently have with our funding. So we haven't engaged on the issues that you referred to on the white paper. But what we are looking at is at the links of between poverty and health outcomes, and of course the inequality that you have talked about and Debbie has already talked about. So,
great. And Debbie, can you comment on the white paper?
Only to say that I think that it's really important that we are health focused, particularly that as we have just come out of a COVID pandemic, and particularly as we know that the communities that are most at risk are those who we know are most likely to experience a range of different forms of inequality. So yes, I'm disappointed, and I do agree that we need to ensure that health is placed at the centre of policy making.
Great. And given the health disparities in London, Debbie, could you just highlight some of the things that you're doing from the GLA to help address this and improve health outcomes for all Londoners?
Sure, yes. So the Mayor launched his Health Inequalities Strategy Implementation Plan, I think it was last year. It's a plan that's been conducted in conjunction with the NHS and other health providers, and indeed he's will shortly be launching his new public health unit. And as part of that implementation plan, we've been able to secure commitment from health providers that they will prioritise the cost of living crisis. So they've been very focused on ensuring that they focus on income maximisation, so making sure that we are doing all we can to raise incomes. So they've had a clear focus on the London living wage and trying to persuade health and social care providers and support them and encourage them as best as possible to ensure that they are paying all of their employees at least the London living wage, because we know that this is one of the key ways that we can try to ensure that incomes are raised. But also, I guess the additional thing to point is that this is at least, and I'm sure that Klara would agree with me, the London living wage itself is something that all employers should be paying at least to their workers, because it enables people to get by, yes, certainly, but also we need to think about ways in which enabling people to leave poverty, not have poverty risk, and to be able to thrive. So paying at least the London living wage is one of the ways that we can do that. So we've been very glad that we've been able to work with health providers to enable them to do that. And I think Tom's been trying to come in for the past couple of seconds.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks. As Debbie just said, and as your sort of question referred to, clearly the work that we are doing on poverty, on low income, is a health inequalities issue. And, if you look at the work that the Mayor's done on health inequalities, actually the role of addressing low income in London, as Debbie said, is actually central to that. So, just suppose in a way, we don't see difference between lots of the work that we're doing on low income and addressing the cost of living and health inequalities. They are hand in hand, and the team is working very closely with the team kind of leading the broader health inequalities agenda, given how central addressing the challenge of poverty, low income as a systemic issue in London, but also the acute crisis we face at the moment. So the work that Debbie's talked about around the cost of living hub as a universal measure, but the advice provision, the work we're doing on food security, the work that we'll kind of bring forward around actually some of that kind of those unclaimed benefits are all work that actually we see as very central to the kind of the delivery of the health inequality strategy, and we're doing that hand in hand with that with the colleagues in the health team.
Thank you. The next question is from Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. Can I start with Torsten, if I may? In your opening remarks, you talked about in-work poverty, and we know that the uprating of working age benefits in April was only just over 3%, whereas inflation at the time was 9%. We're expecting the Chancellor's statement in the next couple of weeks, and there's now some doubt that they will not use this catch-up to actually raise working age benefits in line with inflation, but perhaps the lower, it's about half actually, wages, average wages benefit. Can I ask you, what will that mean for those in receipt of particularly universal credit? And also, what will that mean for local economies if people have less purchasing power in their pockets?
Klara obviously spoke powerfully about the in-work poverty issue as well. So on the specific decision for the Chancellor on what to uprate benefits by in April, here we're talking about whether we uprate them in around 5.5% in line with earnings, or we uprate them by just over 10% in line with prices. We should clearly do the latter. If you look at what's actually going to happen next year, and you look at the very large income falls that look all but inevitable now next year, income falls that we would only normally see in a very deep recession, it looks like we're on course for next year in our projections. Those are particularly concentrated amongst lower income households. Even if we go ahead with the 10% uprating of benefits, we'll see very large falls in incomes for poorer households next year. That is not something we should be considering making worse by not going ahead with an uprating decision. I think there's a slight danger, this goes back to the question that was being asked earlier about the energy support, there's a slight danger that people think that, okay, if we target the energy support via the benefit system, we can do that and not go ahead with the benefit uprating. Obviously, that makes sense from the Treasury's perspective because it means you have a temporary spend, but you don't have a permanent spend, and it's the permanent spend they worry about for the public finances. But the background to that is obviously that the basic level of benefits has been falling pretty much consistently since the early 1990s, falling further behind earnings and actually falling further behind in real terms, particularly over the last decade. And so we can't have a benefit system that just becomes ever more distant from where the majority of the population is, and that's what we've been doing. So it is really important that we don't do that in April. And this is a lot of money. I mean, it's a lot of money for the Treasury. £9 billion is how much you would save by if you uprated disability benefits in line with prices, but didn't do that for pensions and didn't do that for universal credit and other working age benefits, then you would save around £9 billion, but you would take kind of £1,000 off lots of households' incomes. The losses would be particularly large for larger in-work families who would see the biggest amounts of pain, but you'd also see large losses for lots of kinds of households. On the in-work poverty issue in general, I think it is worth stepping back to saying why have you got this happening in London? Okay, and at one level, it's blinding obvious. Housing's very expensive. That's the top issue. But the government has done some things that move the benefit system towards being more useful to London, and I would highlight two. The reduction of the taper rate is particularly important in London. That happened last year, and the move that universal credit does to be more generous to renters overall than the legacy benefits system, which the government doesn't talk about very much because it's bad news for lots of the red wall seats, but good news for London. Yeah, and that's because we've merged the taper rates from the housing benefit system and the rest of the benefit system into one lower rate. So that helps households who are in areas with higher housing costs. They get to keep more benefits further up the income distribution, and that is basically London. Bit of the southeast, but it's basically London. So that should be pushing down on in-work poverty in London. The problem is that the big picture of the benefit system is that we, compared to other countries, provide less basic support, income replacement, and more support for kids and for housing costs. We basically deal with the costs problem, but don't provide much by way of income replacement. The problem is that since 2010, we've not liked doing that. We want to keep the mean income support bit, but we want to stop providing money for kids and housing, and that is then that's what's ramming into London's working poverty problem. So that means freezing the LHA rate, and it means capping support for larger households. Those are the two things that are most acute. So if I was worrying about the benefit system in London, I'd spend a bit less time on UBIs and the others and a bit more time saying, why are we not providing any housing support and in particular, why are we putting almost every large family on low income into poverty? And those are choices that are concretely in the benefit system and could be fixed.
And my question about if low income Londoners have less money in their pockets, what will that mean for local high streets, for example?
Sure. So big picture, poorer households obviously spend a much higher proportion of their income due to not having very much income, and that is that's very material. Indeed, and in particular for areas where you have concentrations of those people.
Thank you. And Klara, can I just ask you if you've anything quickly to add to that? But is there anything more you think the Mayor could be doing to support people in London over and above what Debbie has said that he's doing already?
I think that the work on the living wage is absolutely crucial here. And I think that there is an argument for the living wage actually becoming statutory, the real living wage becoming statutory rather than optional, and that would make a huge difference. But there is also the living hours, and that's an important element, especially for people who are working part-time, who are on different types of contracts, and that's dealing with insecurity. So it's ensuring that people have guaranteed hours, that there is a guaranteed notice, that shift patterns are allowing for people to plan. And I think these two things need to go hand in hand. So I think what would be helpful is to see a bit more of a push for living hours alongside living wage. I think we don't have many living hours accredited employers in London, and yet we do have a lot of people on precarious contract and in insecure work. So I think that would be a crucial thing. And the importance of that is actually not just the level of pay, but the security of income, being able to plan. And that's a huge element where people, even if they are paid the living wage, if they don't have the security, it makes it very, very difficult to budget, very, very difficult to plan. So that's why these two things should really go together, the wage element and the hours element.
Thank you. And Debbie, very quickly. Oh, no, I'm told I can't, but never mind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Assemblymember Best.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Debbie. My question will be to you. You spoke earlier to my colleague about the poorest Londoners not having cars, and this makes me reflect quite heavily on my upbringing in outer London, and I recognise that situation. We didn't have a car for many years, and I remember quite clearly, you know, when I hold back tears trying to carry shopping bags back from the shopping, and the limited opportunities I had, and a quite insular world that we had. And I remember when we did manage to get a car, and I'm quite certain that Rust on Wheels would probably be non-compliant today. And I remember the opportunities that opened up for my family. I remember I was a keen footballer at that point, and I could then go and train with West Ham. For my mum, it opened up a world of opportunities and employment for her. And my concern is that I can see there's so many people that will have that same experience now today. And they'll be looking at the fact that the ULS expansion will cost £250 million. They'll be looking at the fact that the independent report has shown it will have very negligible impact on air quality, and they'll be wondering why that money can't be put into capital investment in public transport, why we couldn't give millions of Londoners free bikes, why we're not just going to take every non-compliant vehicle off the road and give people that support up front. And I'm wondering, as the person that you said earlier is responsible for the cost of living, how are you advocating for that? Because clearly there's a much better way here to help people and not hammer them. So those arguments that you're making, because they seem very clear to the people I talk to in outer London that that's what we should be doing, are those not the arguments that you're making to the Mayor?
There's a lot in there. So I too grew up in outer London, and I too didn't have a car. And all of the things that you describe are hugely important. And I do recognise the way in which it can enable people to get to work, etc., and all of those things. I think that the issue remains, I think, for me, particularly in the crisis that we're facing, and I've mentioned both of the crises despite the other Assembly member saying that this is not targeting the climate crisis. I'm acutely aware that it's really important for us to do all we can to try to bring down costs and to maximise incomes for those on the lowest incomes. Absolutely, because I know that the cost of living crisis will hammer those low-income families and individuals far more than those who are perhaps for the very first time having to come to grips with budgeting and a variety of other things because of how high energy costs and inflation and food costs, etc. is. But then at the same time, I do also recognise the impact that air pollution has on those communities. And as I've mentioned before, I really think that we have to be really clear about the responsibility that we
Debbie,
have.
I do too. No one here is arguing that we don't recognise air pollution.
But that's why,
how better can we spend that money?
But well, I mean, this is why I support the Mayor's drive to try to do all he can to tackle air pollution, as well as doing all he can to tackle cost of living crisis. I don't think that we should try to presume that the two things are mutually exclusive. And I know that you hear what I'm saying and you agree. And I think we owe a responsibility to all of the communities who we serve to show them that we're doing all we can to support them. Now, I know that there were a number of alternatives which were presented to the Mayor in addition to ULEZ. There was smart road user charging, a variety of others.
We could move away from that. There's all the things I just said to help people, not charge them. Why can't we use that 250 million people to help people and reduce air pollution instead of just hammering them and focusing that on the poorest people? It isn't the poorest Londoners that are creating air pollution problems in London.
No, not at all.
So they shouldn't
Absolutely
have to pay up our air, and that's what the ULEZ does. So I would hope, please, Debbie, that you could go and make those representations to the Mayor that there is a better way to do this.
So I have made those representations, as you've mentioned. I do believe that the scrappage scheme that I've mentioned, and I know I can't announce the scrappage scheme because it's not my, I don't have the opportunity to do so. The scrappage scheme will be the way that we will try to ensure that we get those polluting cars off the road and that we support those individuals on the lowest incomes to be able to do so. And it's really important that we try to do all of that. So my representations to the Mayor and my representations to the Environment team have been about the scrappage scheme, because that is the way that we can ensure that those on the lowest incomes are able to buy new cars or to get rid of the cars that they have which are polluting. I think I will maintain the point, and the point that I have to maintain is a really important one. I really think that we have to ensure that what we are saying to Londoners, that we're not saying to Londoners that we care about bringing down your costs, but we don't care about making sure that you have access to clean air. And so this is sending that message to them.
No one's, but we're not disagreeing on that point. We're
really
only agreeing. I'm saying, imagine how much you could spend on a scrappage scheme if you didn't waste all that money on cameras. Imagine if you just put that money into the people's pockets that need it most and didn't spend it on a camera network. And I hope that's a point we can take away, but I'm out of time, so thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Assembly Best. The next question is from Assembly Member Ellie Baker.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to Torsten. The Resolution Foundation's recent briefing on soaring energy prices said that low-income households spend 59% of their income on essentials in 2019. Oh, I've lost the crowd. That's items such as food, fuel, clothes and transport, up from 52% in 2006. Do you have a sense of what percentage of income you think will be spent on these essentials now and over the coming months? And I am actually most interested in transport costs, particularly regulated fares normally go up, RPI or RPI plus. Relevant IPI figure is 12.3. We've been told that it won't be going up by 12.3, but we don't know what it will be going up by. So, so overall, what do you think that proportion, is that going to go up? And do you have anything to say about the transport cost proportion?
So to take those in turn, there are long-term drivers of why lower income households are spending a greater proportion of their consumption basket on essentials, and that doesn't get anywhere near enough discussion. Those are broadly, Britain is a too high inequality country and has been for 4 decades, and then it's been a too low growth quality country for the last 15 years, which is the bit that Liz Truss was right about. And if you put those two things together, lower income households are getting absolutely stuffed. So poorer households in Britain are now 20% poorer than the equivalent poorer households in France, and that is not a situation any of us should think is sustainable, and that's because of that high inequality trend hitting that low growth trend together. Now, and that's what's driving the statistic that you're talking about there, which is an increase in. Most of us probably thought that as Britain got richer, we would spend a smaller proportion of our incomes on essentials. But that's basically the story of the last 150 years, and that's gone into reverse basically for poorer households in the last 15. So that is what we need to put into reverse. Lots of that we have tended to focus on has been housing in London, and now it's energy contributing to that. Specifically on transport, I don't have an estimate for exactly what the exact impact on household budgets would be. All I would say, and this is relevant to discussions about policy choices that affect costs in general, so it's irrelevant to transport costs, it's relevant to something that was mentioned earlier, which is social rent increases, which is in lots of these areas we have pseudo formulas that put up those costs in line with inflation. That doesn't make much sense, as I was saying earlier, in an era, and it's doing that because that's how it's balancing the needs of the provider of the service, the housing association or the transport service, with the consumer. That doesn't make much sense in an era where, as I said earlier, the country's getting poorer and we're deciding who's bearing the pain from that. So I don't think housing associations should be putting up. I think the government's probably going to stop them doing it in the near future. But the idea that we're going to be putting up housing association rents, I think it was actually above inflation was the plan. That's totally untenable and shouldn't have taken the government stepping in to stop housing associations doing it, which has trade-offs for those housing associations' budgets. But that's the world we live in as we become poorer. And the same thing applies in transport costs. So it is really hard for Transport for London in an environment where obviously there's wider challenges caused by the pandemic for its budget, but we ain't putting up transport costs by 12%.
Thanks very much for that. So following up, I'd like to turn to Debbie and potentially Tom. So the Mayor has recently extended free travel. I'm interested in the policy choices basically around transport costs. The Mayor has recently extended free travel to 5,000 of the lowest paid TfL outsourced workers, and really hoping that will go a way for those people to mitigate the cost of living increases. So do you have a sense of view, and have you advocated in terms of decisions around transport costs, fares costs, where it should be targeted? So is there particular forms of transport that we need to make sure continue to be affordable? Is it concessions? What's going to be the biggest impact for those people most at risk of cost of living? Does that make sense?
Yes, it did. I fully supported the Mayor's decision to enable those workers, so the workers who were not previously covered by the TfL free fares, to be able to have access to free fares, because obviously we know that when it comes to avoiding poverty, particularly in a city like London, there are particular costs which can exacerbate poverty for those on the lowest incomes, and transport is one of them. I know that it would have been a really difficult decision to raise the fares, as he did. And I have made sure, as have others I know in this room, that we protect as many of those concessions as possible. So free travel for children in particular, and making sure that older Londoners, where we can, are able to also benefit from free travel. I think as we go forward, we are always going to have to ensure, and I will continue to make representations as much as I possibly can. We will always need to make sure that we are pulling down those costs as much as possible for those on the very lowest incomes. And I know that the rate at which fares have risen, it's around 4.8%, I believe. It isn't the rate of inflation, as Torsten has mentioned, and it's really important that we keep those rises below that rate as far as possible, because anything that starts to rise in line with that figure, which I know is the highest it's been for 40 years, will be catastrophic for those on the lowest income. So I support what the Mayor's done with the free travel. We have to make sure that those fees don't continue. Any potential rises do not go in line with inflation. We do actually have some of the lowest bus travel, though, in the country. So that is one thing that it's really important for us to always remember.
Thanks very much. I've run out of time,
Sorry.
but just to say no. And I really hope that Transport for London listen to you and your team's advocacy.
Great, thank you. The next question will be from Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. This question is to Debbie. It's a very nice segue, actually. Thank you. Talking about bus travel. As I'm sure you know, the cost of living in London is affecting the older generation, especially those over 60. And as you also know, the Mayor recently cut the concession of allowing 60 plus people travelling before 9 o'clock. Now, I mean, there is some argument that maybe those who can afford to probably should pay, but there are a lot of people who can't, and I get a number of people writing to me, pensioners, people who give their time up for charity, who the charity people just can't do the charity volunteering anymore. But more importantly, there's a number of pensioners who can't get to their hospital appointments. Now, I do understand that to cost out both the tube, train and bus would be very expensive, but would it not be possible to at least make a concession for them to use the buses before 9 o'clock?
So I've also had various groups make representations to me over that very same issue. I meet regularly with the London Age Friendly Forum, who have raised this with me on a couple of occasions, and I'm glad you've brought this to my attention. I think you've made the point correctly in relation to TfL finances and some of the decisions that obviously have had to be made by the Mayor. There are a couple of decisions, and we've talked about a few of them already, which are decisions which have been difficult to make, obviously, and you'll know that this is a Mayor who has been very keen and clear that he wants to make sure that transport is as affordable as possible for all. So that would be one of the issues which has mitigated, unfortunately, against him being able to keep those concessions for everyone. I think on the other side, though, what we are also seeking to do is to make sure that those who are on the very, very lowest incomes, so those pensioners who you mention, who are on low incomes, do still need to get around London. We are hopefully shortly beginning a campaign to ensure that those individuals are able to claim pension credit, because we know that there are a huge number of older Londoners who are likely eligible for that support but aren't aware or wouldn't consider themselves to be. And so what we would like to also be doing in conjunction with local authorities, and it's a campaign that we'll be announcing very shortly, is to enable those individuals to be aware of their eligibility, be able to make those claims and be able to maximise their incomes as they should do, because they have the right to be able to do so. So that is a campaign that we are also doing to try to make sure that we're doing all we can to support those pensioners, and we would be happy to share information about that campaign with the Assembly once we launch it.
That's very laudable, and that's a good initiative, and recognise that. But it doesn't actually really help a larger number who probably are already claiming that benefit, who still are not able to get to the hospitals, still not able to do the volunteering for their charities, and that affects the charities as well, because the charities are struggling to get volunteers. I won't go into the ULEZ argument on charities. One of my charities is going to be in really deep trouble if the ULEZ expansion comes out, because we use vehicles to collect goods from people that don't comply, and we really will be in serious trouble. But why is it that that you cannot consider just allowing people to use the buses?
This would be something that I would suggest you put in front of the Deputy Mayor for Transport. So Seb Dance would be the one to whom you it would be best to make that kind of representation clearly. It's and I can only reaffirm that it's a very difficult decision when you have to decide who can have concessions and who can't. But one of the things that I'm certainly driving from my team is making sure that all of those individuals who we know are struggling financially are able to maximise their incomes as much as possible. And we know that there is a huge number, I think it's up to £1 billion, of unclaimed pension credit. And if we were to work in conjunction with all of the boroughs across the city, we would be able to raise around £10 million for Londoners who are over the age of 60 to be able to make those claims.
I'm out of time, but could I just ask you to use your offices to lobby to help these pensioners and the charities? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Assembly Member Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. In the course of this conversation, we've talked about London having the highest levels of poverty nationwide. We've talked about 50% of the poor in London being working poor. So what representations have you made to the Mayor to lower his costs for Londoners?
Which costs specifically are you talking about?
Well, any cost that takes your fancy. We've had a record rise in the mayoral precept. He's planning to spend £250 million on cameras, an additional £150 million on looking at what else he can do for road user price charging. My point is, in your role as Deputy Mayor, what have you said to him to lower his impact on Londoners? We've talked a lot about what the government can do, but of course the Mayor has direct control over £19 billion. What is he doing to lower the cost towards Londoners?
So I actually haven't spoken at all about what I think government can do, and I could probably wax lyrical about that, so I shan't on this occasion. But the representations that I make to the Mayor are in relation to the work that we are doing to ensure that all individuals are able to maximise their incomes, either through the benefit system or by ensuring that they're able to access work which pays them at least the London living wage. And also the Mayor has, as you'll know, given that he has the delegated adult education budget, is investing significantly in making sure that individuals who are on the lowest incomes are able to skill up in order to be able to access work that will pay more for them. So there is a great deal of work that we have been doing, that I have been working with other deputy mayors across the building and with the Mayor himself to ensure that we are doing all we can to raise those incomes for individuals who we know are at severe risk of destitution during this winter because they are already on some of the lowest incomes. And these are some of the ways that I know we can make the greatest difference. One of the clear drivers of poverty, as anyone who works in the poverty space will know, is that you have to ensure that people have enough in their household incomes to cover their costs. And there are a huge number of individuals still in our city, unfortunately, who are being paid below the London living wage. So the Mayor's campaign to increase the number of employers who are paying LLW is a laudable piece of work, and it should hopefully ultimately result in around 50,000 Londoners being able to at least be able to earn what they should be earning in order to be able to get by, in addition to some of the other projects that I've mentioned to you.
What you're saying is it may well be correct, but I asked you what reputations you have made to the Mayor to lower his cost for Londoners. All of what you've just said is to maximise people's incomes, yes, which is great, but the Mayor, the quickest thing he can do is control the money that he has direct influence over. So I ask you again, what have you said to the Mayor about lowering his cost on Londoners? Again, record rise in the mayoral precept. We have £250 million have been spent on cameras, which to my mind would be better spent giving people a decent scrappage scheme. So I'm very interested in how you're going to lower the impact that the Mayor is having on Londoners, the high cost he's pushing onto Londoners.
So on the council tax point, I think it's an important point that you make. The Mayor, I think, has been very clear that he believes council tax to be a regressive tax, and he is very aware that there are decisions around raising council tax which have had to be taken by local authority leaders.
Sorry, Mayor, I didn't say local councils. I said the mayoral precept. That's a decision he makes, not local councils make.
But he's had to make that decision because he knows that funding that needs to be made available for all of the services that he has a responsibility for paying for, which includes the London Fire Brigade and police numbers, he has not received enough funding from government to be able to do so. So he has had to, unfortunately, make the decision to raise the council tax precept in that way. But he has said that it's a regressive tax. It's not something that he
So why
thinks
did he do it then?
He's had to do it, as I've just mentioned before, because he hasn't received the funding that he needs to be able to pay for London Fire Brigade, police numbers, and he is using that money in order to make sure that Londoners are kept safe.
Well, but he's not. He's using at least £250 million of that £250 million of that money to buy cameras to inflict on Londoners, particularly outer Londoners, the poorest Londoners who have no alternative because there isn't good transport links in outside London, out in outer London. He's using that money to inflict pain on them. So is he using it for a cash cow? Because that's what it would seem like. He isn't lowering his impact on them.
I can't comment on the cameras. I'm really sorry. It's not something that I have responsibility for. So I would probably suggest that it's best for the Deputy Mayor for Transport to come and speak to you on that particular issue.
It's probably best for the Mayor to be here, but thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. The next question is from Assemblymember Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. My question is to you, Torsten. So we have been in a period of stagnating wages, which in reality are real pay terms cuts. What does this mean for London's economy, and what do Londoners need from the Mayor and the government for wages to keep up with prices? And would you agree with me that the cost of living crisis is also a low wages crisis, best symbolized by the Amazon workers who've only been offered a 35p an hour wage increase, whilst energy companies are raking in immense profits?
So weak wage growth and the squeeze that is posing on household living standards is the defining kind of political economy feature of the last 15 years, and none of us thought it was possible, and it turns out not only is it possible, but it can go on for year after year after year. In terms of the drivers of that, I think you've got to separate out two different things that are going on, both of which that are making Britain poorer and making London poorer. The first is very weak productivity growth. We're not investing enough, and we're not getting better at doing what we do as businesses. And although I often read people saying, oh, London's economy has kind of pulled further ahead of the rest of the country over the last 10 years, London's great, everywhere else is rubbish. On productivity growth, that is nonsense. Actually, the reason London's GDP has become growth in the last decade has been too reliant on more people working and more people working longer hours. Average hours in London have been going up, and employment's been going up. Those are good things in of themselves, but London's productivity is not rising fast enough. There's far too much backslapping about London business and not enough realising we're not doing well enough. So what the Mayor should do, I mean, if I'm honest, I don't see much focus on boosting London's productivity coming out of either the GLA or from the Mayor of London, so why don't you start?
Okay. I'm limited for time, so I want to get you in, Debbie. The Resolution Foundation analysis found that private pay is growing at 6% per year against 2% in the public sector, the biggest gap on record. The government has indicated further public sector cuts, which will likely mean pay freezes for hard-working public service workers. Will you be advocating for Londoners working in the public sector, like the City of London Corporation and National Health Service ambulance staff, who are currently being balloted over the low pay offers that they've had, to see that their wages beat inflation, something the GMB trade union are actively campaigning for? And can also add the GMB trade union is also organising the Amazon workers to get a proper sort of pay rise. And the Mayor has written to Amazon expressing his concerns.
Yes. Our public sector workers keep our city going, and they need to be paid above the rate of inflation, and they need to be supported and recognised for the contribution that they make to our city. So absolutely.
Thank you. These people only strike as a last resort. And can you just find out the Mayor whether he has had a reply from Amazon? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. Good morning. Debbie, in your opening little speech, you said, I'm quoting, over half of Londoners have told us that they are struggling. Half of London is 4.5 million people. How have you spoken to all those people?
We have a regular poll that we conduct, which is a representative sample of Londoners. So if half of those who we poll tell us respond to us on anything, then that's taken to represent half of London. It's the way that polling works.
Not very accurate, though, is it? How many people are in that poll?
I don't know how many people are in that poll. It's a YouGov poll that's conducted on behalf of the GLA.
You don't know? Okay, so you make a sweeping statement like that. There are 9.5 million people in London, and you take that then as to be correct.
It's not a sweeping statement. It's a piece of it's polling. So you know. The way that polling works, it tends to be a representative sample of all of the different groups.
I also, if people listen to you, over half of Londoners have told us.
Yes,
that's not
in
actually,
polling.
That is not correct.
It is true, because if it's a poll...
Yeah, you don't even know how many people are in that poll. I would just say to you, it's a sweeping statement. It's a worrying statement, but it's a sweeping statement that may not be correct at all.
So the only thing that I will add is, as a person who's worked in research before myself, I do know that it is entirely fine if you do a poll, which is a representative poll of whichever population that you're seeking to get views from. You are able to take the results of that poll and say, whatever that poll has told you represents the population whom the poll is represented. So it's not a lie and it's not incorrect. It's polling that's done on our behalf.
With respect, I never said you were lying. I said it was a sweeping statement. No, be careful.
Someone
be
said
careful
that. Someone said that I was lying. I do apologise.
Hang on. Look, hang on. There's only one chair here, and that's me. So can you please have all those questions and comments through me?
Yeah, matter of personal explanation, because I've been named. Yeah, I did call out a lie, so it wasn't my colleague.
You weren't named?
I was named over there.
Hang on. Listen to me. Can we please keep this? You haven't been named, right? I haven't heard it, right? Hang on. The question was asked by Assemblymember Hall. I want to carry on with the answer from the Deputy Mayor.
Well, I need to give a personal explanation.
Okay. I'll come to later.
Thank you. That's fine. Thank you.
Right.
Back to the discussion.
I will continue to say it is a sweeping statement, and I don't think it's well qualified, and I'm not at all impressed. You don't know how many people would be in that poll. Given that, in your opinion, over half of Londoners, so £4.5 million, are struggling, that is of great concern. I go back to the point made by my colleague, Assembly Member Bailey. Why on earth has the council tax, his council tax precept, gone up by nearly 45% in his 6 years? That's not helping Londoners.
So I provided an answer to Assembly Member.
Right, I was giving you the opportunity to say something else. Clearly you think that's acceptable. It seems to be all right if the Mayor puts money up, if the Mayor takes money from the poor, as has been evidenced by Assembly Member Garrett in his comments about the ULEZ. It is the poorest that are going to be paying that bill. There's £250 million of out of the 19 billion that the Mayor has, that is going into a scheme that I can assure you outer Londoners do not want. 66% in the survey say they don't want it. Those of us that are councillors in outer London, I can assure you don't want it. And from the People's Question Time last night, I can assure you they don't want it. So £250 million is being spent. When you're telling me, and you're insisting on it, that half of Londoners are struggling and the poorest Londoners are going to be paying that money for the ULEZ, how on earth, in your position, looking at the poorest and how to alleviate problems for the poorest, or half of Londoners, as you put it, how can you think that that is correct?
So in as much as you hopefully now accept what I've said about the 53%, I will accept what you have said about the 66 and the various other estimations that you've given me of outer London. I will maintain the point that I maintained earlier. It is not mutually exclusive for us to be able to address the cost of living crisis whilst also tackling air pollution. I think it is incumbent upon all of us as decision makers to ensure that what we are doing benefits all individuals from all backgrounds. And if we know that air pollution affects particular communities more than it does others, then it's incumbent upon us to ensure that our policies are directly targeting those individuals and helping them to ensure that they are able to live healthy lives.
But you see, this doesn't target all people. The people this is going to affect the most are the poorest. They are the poorest. This has been demonstrated by my colleagues. So I will leave it there because I know my time is up. But may I just say, I think some of your answers show to many of us here that the decision has been made to put this ULEZ in, and I can assure you the public do not want it. Thank you, Chair.
May I add, I have not said at any point, I have repeatedly said, and I know that there have been people who have been laughing while I've been saying it, but the Mayor does have to make his final... He has to make his final decision. There is a consultation out. An analysis has been done on the results of that.
Thank you, Chair.
And once he's done that, he will make his decision, and I'm sure he will come to all of you with his decision. I would never, ever try to say that something has happened before the announcement has been finalised.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Look, I need to really intervene on this. First of all, I think that points of order don't need to be interruptions to debate when they were raised. Secondly, it just brings me back to the question that all comments should be made through the chair, and heckling is not appropriate here. I didn't hear the comment that as Assembly Member Prince was named as a liar, but I did hear the Deputy Mayor refer to, and I'm not lying. Therefore, the interpretation is that someone did say that the lie had taken place. It's very unfortunate. I didn't hear it, but I do think the Assembly Member Prince is entitled to make a point of observation on that matter, okay? But I just want to remind you again, stop heckling, please. Stop making rogue comments, right, which are not appropriate. But I wouldn't have taken any further, but the Deputy Mayor did refer to that question in the answer, and therefore I think that is an issue, right, okay?
Right. Thank you, Chair. Yes, Debbie, I've had years of experience in advertising and marketing. And, of course, if you do a survey...
This is a point of order, not a question.
No, it's a point of explanation.
Just quickly for 1 minute, right? It's not a question to the Deputy Mayor.
No, I'm not asking the Mayor a question. I'm explaining the point. And the point is that you're quite right. If you've done a survey which indicates that 53% of the people support a particular act, then you're quite right to say that you've done a survey that suggests 53% of Londoners support what you're doing. It is not correct, and it is not. No, please, Chair, let me finish.
No, I'm not. Assemblymember Prince, I asked you to give an explanation. It's not a directly comment to the Deputy Mayor, right? Okay. In that case, you've had your moment. You lost the opportunity. We're proceeding on now.
No, Chair, please.
I have made a decision, Keith. I have made a decision. If you want to disagree with it afterwards, you can.
I'll make a complaint then.
Thank
Chair,
you.
fine.
You can make a complaint to the appropriate body.
Because you have to put it into context. You have to put it into context.
I'm now going to proceed with the rest of the debate. The next Assembly member is Anne Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Since we have an expert in the room and we do believe in experts, I just would like, Torsten, could you just briefly comment on representative polling?
I mean, there's quite a lot of serious stuff happening in London right now, so I'd rather talk about what's going on with people's energy bills, what's happening to their taxes, what's happening to their benefits, and I think a discussion about how exactly you want to use representative polling isn't doing justice to what Londoners are very focused on right now. So I'd rather not.
Fair enough. I just want to, Debbie, I take your point about the cost of living crisis. You know, at the same time we have an air pollution crisis. I'm also a councillor and I represent a ward that's poor. We have poor air quality and we have long queues at the food bank where I volunteer, and all of these things are unacceptable at the same time. And currently, a lot of it is underwater, as we experienced flooding last night. But a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing nationally, including from the Prime Minister, has been around London being a wealthy city, that we could well take funds away from urban areas and distribute them away. I'm just wondering what you're able to do and what you are doing in your position, what your office is doing to work with stakeholders to lobby the government to ensure that London is going to get its fair share of levelling up funding.
Wow, that's a really good question. So all of you will be aware that the Mayor and the Chair of the London Councils have been running the Recovery Board, and that's a board which represents leaders of industry, as well as all of the councils from across our city of a variety of different political persuasions, as well as CVS, the NHS, etc. And that's a board which has also agreed that it's really important for them to use their power as a board representing key decision makers across London to make representations to government about ensuring that London does get its fair share in relation to levelling up. And Paul Scully, the Minister for London, who was invited and wasn't able to attend, has also been making representations on our behalf to government and on that basis. So it is something that we've been doing in conjunction with other leaders, because we think that there's strength in united voices and coalition, because this is an unequal city and we do have some of the highest rates of child poverty in the entire country. And for anyone to look at London and to think that it is a city where people is dripping in wealth, those people are mistaken, and it's really important for us to make those representations. So we have definitely been doing that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm particularly concerned that it's not just London that's seen as being wealthy, but I represent Barnet and Camden, which is talked up constantly by politicians and people who want to make cheap shots. And actually, it's completely unhelpful to have this idea of a North London elite that seems to have come from Donald Trump's talk about metropolitan elite in New York City, and it needs to stop. And so I would encourage everyone around this table to stop that, and politicians at all levels to stop talking down London. I'm just want Klara, the Trust for London have called on the government to urgently implement a national package of support to help with increasing energy prices, targeting greatest help at low-income households. What are the consequences for Londoners, vulnerable Londoners, if that doesn't happen?
I think the consequences have been talked about quite a lot. The package of support is needed, and the consequences will be that people will not be eating and will be cold in their houses. It is as simple as that. So I think that is the reality we need to be talking about. And I think bringing it back to the point that I made initially, we should not need food banks. We should not need warm places, and that's the consequence of not supporting the poorest Londoners. So that that is plain, and I think we can see it already, and we haven't had winter yet.
Thanks for that. Is everything okay? Okay, sorry, there's something else going on there. Thank you for that. I think it's we keep hearing about choosing between heating and eating. Okay, and I think what's clear is actually people are currently choosing neither. It's really bad. So back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Finished? Good. Thank you. Assembly Member Fortune, please.
Thank you. Since we've been here this morning, the interest rates have gone up as we expected, up to 3%. So this is real. There's real impact out there in the community. And one of the things that drives economic dysfunction and disparity across the capital is housing and housing supply. Now, the record from City Hall is not great on that. Of the nearly 5 billion that was received in 2016 to build 116,000 affordable homes, there's still about 25,000 of them that need to be delivered in the next couple of months. The second tranche that came in of another 4 billion, and that was to build 35,000 homes, that's not even been started yet. So that's not a great record, and recognising that supply is what drives that economic disparity. Debbie, in your role as Deputy Mayor, and I'm quite new to understanding what Deputy Mayors do and what impacts they can have on delivery. What have you been doing to help champion the delivery of that housing so that we can push up the amount of affordable housing in London to help those people that need it the most?
So the Deputy Mayor for Housing is the one who drives that work. So Tom Compley sits on this cost of living working group that I mentioned a little bit earlier when we were talking about communal heating. And so I do have conversations with Tom and other deputy mayors about the way in which different areas of work that they have responsibility for are impacting upon individuals in London in relation to the cost of living crisis, and how we can ensure that this work is bringing down their costs as far as possible. As far as I'm aware, and this is me speaking without having housing in my portfolio, I am aware that the Mayor's record on building of affordable housing has been a good one, and that and I think it was in 2019, I think he had the highest number of affordable housing starts since, I don't know, since records began. So as far as I'm aware, I know that he is. I think you can cut up how you measure that, but I
get where you're going with the answer. But what I'm keen to know is that organisationally here, we don't have silo working. When you have that silo working in organisations, that's when things get missed. So with your role championing those people that need support, I would imagine you would have the influence on what Tom and what Jules are doing in their portfolios. So then where do you stand in terms of rent control and how that might impact people who are trying to find housing, especially people that might be trying to find housing in the future?
So I think you'll all be aware that the Mayor has recently called for a rent freeze.
But rent capping.
Advocated for a rent freeze that he said will have a very positive impact on renters in London. I think it would.
Do you think that will have a positive benefit to renters now and in the future?
Yes, absolutely.
Because if you look at San Francisco studies, things like that, what it does argue is that actually that money goes from the more wealthy to the younger and less well off in the future.
I mean, in a city like London, when we have such a high number of renters, and given how high London rents are, and given how much I know, for example, that the private rented sector is a place which does drive poverty, because there are a lot of people living in poverty in the private rented sector, I would definitely advocate for the prices of rent to be capped. In order for individuals to not have to be spending so much of their income on rent. So I
do you recognise that would that have any, in your view, would that have any detrimental economic impact over the next sort of 10, 15 years?
I really can't comment.
Especially on supply, especially when you compare us to somewhere like Germany, where you've got big organisations or institutions that hold the housing compared to London.
On that, I can't comment. All I can comment on is that I know that rent is too high for those on lowest incomes, and that there are too many people on low incomes in our private rented sector. And given that the mayor doesn't have any powers over the private rented sector,
I'm running out of time because I'm stuck to the clock. So can you send us the work that's been done to look at the impact of rent controls, not just now, not just the immediate impact, but what impact will that have looking at supply in 5, 10, 15 years?
That's not something I know about, sorry.
Nearly.
You are out of time. Great. Thank you. Next question. I think maybe the last question for this session will be from Assembly Member Skin Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the whole panel. It's been an incredibly informing, if not discussing, depression so far, but I think there's a lot of conversation to continue having on this, so hopefully we'll all continue working together to try and do the best to make sure we navigate Londoners out of this crisis. I wanted to ask, Klara, I'll start with yourself if that's all right, and then Torsten, move on to you. Specifically referring to Paul Scully, the Minister of London, who didn't feel it was important for him to come and address the London Assembly this morning. He recently stated that there is fat that needs to be trimmed from local government budgets, which I think is absurd if that man has ever sat in a budget meeting in councils that there's any fat to be trimmed. So my question to you is, what public services do you feel are likely to be cut in this context, and what effect will it have on Londoners?
Well, what we are hearing from the groups on the ground that we are finding, many of whom have some statutory funding as well, is that they don't see anything that can be cut. The funding to those organizations from government, central and local, has already been squeezed. And they say to me, there is nothing more we can do to lower our budgets. So if there are further cuts, it will have a direct implication on organizations that are providing essential services. We talked about the need for increasing of benefits advice. All of these advice services depend on funding. If that funding is cut, our ambition to ensure that people get the benefits they're entitled to is going to be thwarted, and that is a very clear example. And it's also very much linked to people's poverty, because people who work in the third sector, in the advice sector, are often the ones that are low paid. They are the only thing these organizations can cut still is people's salaries, and it's also number of people that are available. So if on one hand we are arguing for living wage, on the other hand we are actually saying we will not be able to fund these organizations to do that, then we are creating and adding onto the crisis. We will not have the advice available, and we will have people that are being pushed into poverty that are supposed to be providing advice to those that are already poor.
Thank you. And Torsten, I'll bring you in, but I might even just add, I think it's just come in that we now see the biggest rise in interest rates in 33 years, and we are in recession. And the Bank of England has said that this could be the longest recession on record. So, the point of crisis and mismanagement of this government is very clear now. So in that context in particular, I'd like you to answer the question around public services and the impact on Londoners, please.
Sure. So the downturn in the economy that's going on in the UK and will be going on in Europe is driven primarily by the global gas prices we were talking about earlier, and those are particularly hard hitting the UK for the reasons I set out about our electricity also being overwhelmingly generated from gas. And in that world, a country like the UK is going to be in recession if global gas prices are doing what they are doing, and that puts us in a very difficult situation. It's also the same reason why you're getting the rise in interest rates that has been announced today. In terms of where does that leave public spending, I think the really important thing is to understand the context within which the current discussion about spending levels is taking place, which is, as I said earlier, you're discussing it at the end of a decade of austerity, not at the beginning of a decade of austerity. And so thinking about that context and the decisions that were made previously is really important to what is remotely feasible to do now. So I'd highlight two aspects of that. One is, on the overall balance of public spending, we've obviously been moving that away from local authorities and towards, in particular, the NHS, and a bit more recently, theoretically at least, towards defence. That is not sustainable on the current basis. And then within that budget pot, what has been going on is a movement of the more limited amount of local government funding that is available from less affluent areas towards more affluent areas. That's the trend of the last 10 years. And that is, and some politicians have talked about reversing that. Some of Levelling Up seems to be recognising you probably can't underfund lots of poorer places at the same time as cutting the overall budgets if you don't want very large cuts in some local authorities' budgets. The worst cases of that aren't in London. They're in the north of England predominantly, but there are some, and the Midlands I should say, but there are some in London that have seen very large budget cuts as well, and that should be seen as a really hard constraint on further cuts to local government funding. You'll all have seen statements from all London boroughs about their spending totals. More generally, that's the 10-year history. Obviously, the short-term history is we've already got the spending review for the present years, running us up to 24-25. Those budgets were set at a time when we thought inflation would look like 2% a year, and it's not looking like that. The effect of that, which is hard to calculate accurately, but is something in the order of magnitude of a £20 billion real cut in total public spending, day-to-day public spending, compared to what we thought it was going to be. So cuts are already happening. High inflation is driving them rather than actual cash cuts in this spending review. I don't think they're going to be cut deeper than that. And so those two things are the context to the decisions, which are really about what happens to budgets in 25-26.
Thank you. Let's hope this government is listening and we stop having cuts to our public services and stop punishing Londoners. Thank you very much, Chair.
You're out. Okay. Thank you to all members of the panel for such an exciting meeting this morning. We have now reached the end of the question session. The Assembly has some further business to deal with. You're welcome to leave the chamber if you so wish. Can I ask the Assembly to agree the motion set out on the agenda in my name, namely that the Assembly notes the answers to questions asked? Can we note the response received to a petition presented at the 8th September 22 London Assembly plenary meeting? The Assembly is recommended to agree that the appointment of Suzanne McCarthy and Alan Simcock as independent persons under Section 28(7) of the Localism Act 2011 be extended to 31st December 2023, noting that this is a joint decision with the Mayor.
Can I make a point here, please? Yes. I have made a point in leaders' meetings to our Chief Officer this time last year that this had to be sorted out properly, not left to the last minute, which has been left to the last minute again. This has got nothing to do with the persons that are being appointed. It's everything to do with the organisation of this place and sorting this out properly, not at the last minute yet again. So I put in an objection. I won't agree to it on this basis. I fully accept it's got to go through, but it's about time this was sorted out properly.
Well, Assembly Member Hall, this is the first I've heard of this. I was merely reading the document.
Fair enough. Nothing to do with you, Chair. I'm just very irritated with the senior officers for not getting this sorted properly. And I think my colleagues can agree with me. And so hopefully we're not in the same situation next year when they forgot to do it right up until the last minute, then have to rush it through a meeting. Okay. It's unacceptable.
Assembly Hall, will your comment noted here on the record?
Good.
Can we approve this now? Thank you. Okay. It's proposed that the London Assembly agrees to the use of the 1st December 22 plenary meeting to be held at 10 a.m, principally to hold a question and answer session on policing in London with Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, and Sir Mark Rahilly, QPM, Commissioner for Police of the Metropolis. Can we agree with this recommendation? The next meeting of the London Assembly is scheduled to be the Mayor's Question Time meeting, which will take place at 10 a.m. on Thursday, 17th November, in this chamber at City Hall. And there's no urgent business that I know of, so I'll call this meeting to end. Thank you.